I took the position at Badger Creek Ranger Station in Glacier National Park because I was running from something. Not running from a person, though that would have been easier to explain. I was running from a version of myself I couldn't recognize anymore. After 10 years working rangers posts in more populated parks, Yosemite, the Grand Canyon, I'd seen too many tourists ignore warnings, watched too many rescue operations, held too many hands of people who didn't believe the wilderness owed them nothing. I needed quiet. I needed distance. The job posting mentioned isolation, which made it perfect. Badger Creek Station sits 6 miles from the nearest maintained road, accessed only by a rough Forest Service road that becomes impassable in winter. The previous ranger had retired after 15 years, and the Park Service was desperate to fill the position. They didn't ask many questions when I applied. A solid record, proper credentials, clean background check, that was enough. I arrived in late July, driving my ranger truck up that rough access road, watching the pine trees grow denser and taller until they seemed to lean in toward the road. The station itself was modest. A small cabin with a workshop, a storage shed, and communication equipment that ran on a backup generator when the weather turned bad. Behind the cabin, Badger Lake stretched for about a quarter mile, dark and still even in the afternoon sun. The water looked cold. It was always cold. The cabin had been recently cleaned but had that particular smell of closing down, musty air, old wood, something trapped and stale. I opened every window despite the chill. My predecessor's wife had packed up most of the personal items, but a few things remained. A worn poker set on the shelf above the kitchen table, a coffee-stained field guide to mountain birds with handwritten notes in the margins, a radio set to a frequency that no longer broadcast anything but static. I spent my first week learning the routes, checking the perimeter of my assigned sector, a 20,000-acre section of the park's northeast region. The job was straightforward. Monitor trails, respond to emergency calls, conduct search and rescue operations if needed, report wildlife activity, and maintain the station itself. July and August meant occasional hikers, though most had the sense to stick to the main trails and the developed campgrounds closer to park headquarters. My area was off the usual tourism circuit. The solitude suited me. I radioed in my daily check-ins, filed my reports, maintained the equipment. I had supplies delivered twice a month. For the rest of the time, I had the forest and the lake and my own thoughts. That was enough for about 4 weeks. The first thing I noticed was the silence at Badger Lake. It wasn't the normal silence of remote wilderness. Wilderness has sounds if you know how to listen. Birds, wind, water, the small movements of animals. But the lake had a silence that seemed almost deliberate, as if the forest around it had learned to hold its breath. I mentioned this to myself in my journal one evening in mid-August. A habit I'd picked up to document wildlife activity and unusual observations. Minimal bird activity at lake. No songbirds observed. Seen 3 ravens, behavior normal. Water level stable. Recommend continued monitoring. Professional, scientific, safe. What I didn't write down was that I'd stood at the dock for an hour and heard nothing except my own breathing and the gentle lap of water against wood. On August 23rd, I found the first sign of trespassers. The trails in my sector weren't maintained at the standard level of the main park routes. They were rougher, less marked, the kind of trails that only experienced hikers with proper maps would attempt. I did a perimeter walk that morning, something I tried to do every other day, when I found evidence of a camp about 3 miles northeast of the station. Someone had built a fire ring about 30 yards off trail, in a small clearing surrounded by dense lodgepole pines. The fire was cold, the ashes gray and scattered by recent wind. I estimated it was at least a week old. Beside the fire ring, I found the remains of what might have been a tent footprint, though the pine needles had already begun reclaiming the area. There were no other supplies, no trash, no personal items. Whoever had camped here had been careful about leaving minimal trace. That should have been the end of it. Unauthorized camping happens. I would file a report, increase patrols in the area, maybe post some additional trail signage. But then, 2 days later, I found the second camp. This one was closer, maybe 2 miles northeast, in another clearing near a tributary that fed into Badger Lake. The setup was nearly identical. Cold fire ring, minimal disturbed area, no trash, but this time there were symbols carved into the bark of the surrounding trees. They weren't random marks. Each symbol was deliberate, cut deep into the white flesh of the aspen trees in what looked like the same hand. The marks formed a rough pattern around the clearing, crude geometric shapes, some angular, some curved. I photographed everything and radioed it in. The ranger who answered from the main office, a woman named Kess, said it sounded like it could be evidence of illegal rituals or cult activity. It had happened before in remote park areas. They would send someone out to investigate, though it might take a couple of days. In the meantime, I should maintain a low profile, not engage anyone I encountered, and report any sightings of trespassers. I hung up the radio feeling worse than before I'd called. That night, I stayed inside the cabin with all the lights on. I told myself it was necessary paperwork. Filing incident reports, updating my records, reviewing the previous ranger's logs to see if anything similar had been documented. What I was really doing was filling the silence with bureaucratic noise and electric light. The previous ranger's logs, maintained in a leather-bound journal, were meticulous. Notes dated back 5 years. Most entries were routine: wildlife sightings, weather events, maintenance tasks. But scattered throughout were small notations that caught my attention. August 12th, heard unusual sounds near lake around midnight. Investigated in morning, found nothing. Likely elk, though unusual behavior. August 19th, received report from daytime hiker about figures in the forest near Ridge Trail. Could not confirm. Over-imaginative tourist. August 25th, dog would not go near lake today. Stayed at cabin. Fine. September 2nd, found what appeared to be large animal tracks near water, not consistent with known wildlife patterns. Possible black bear, though tread marks unusual. All of these entries were from the past 2 years, and they were all from August and September. I checked further back. The previous entries, from 3 and 4 years ago, were sparse during the late summer months. A change in pattern, then a cluster, then references to things the ranger couldn't quite explain. On the final page of the journal, dated September 4th of the previous year, the day before the ranger had begun his retirement leave, there was a single sentence: "It's learning what we look like." The sound started in early September. I'd been at Badger Creek for 5 weeks. I was sleeping better than I had in years, my sleep uninterrupted by the ambient noise of nearby civilization. My cabin's isolation was exactly what I'd needed. Until it wasn't. The sounds began after midnight. I would wake to what I could only describe as calling, not an animal's cry or the wind, but something that resembled human speech filtered through some kind of distortion. It came from the direction of the lake, usually occurring between 2 and 4 a.m., lasting anywhere from 5 minutes to an hour. The first night, I told myself it was a coyote, despite knowing that coyotes don't sound like that. The second night, I convinced myself it might be an elk in distress. By the third night, I was standing on the porch at 2:30 a.m., armed with my service pistol and a heavy flashlight, trying to pinpoint the source. The lake's surface was dark, motionless. The calling seemed to come from across the water, from the thick forest on the far side. When I pointed my flashlight toward the sound, it would immediately stop. Within 30 seconds of the beam hitting the water, silence would fall complete and absolute. Then, after my heartbeat slowed, the calling would resume from a slightly different location. I began documenting the sounds in my journal, describing them in clinical terms: frequency variations, duration, pattern changes. What I didn't document was that the sounds seemed to be becoming more articulate. On the 5th night, I could almost distinguish individual syllables. On the 7th night, I was certain I heard my name, not the way a person might call out, not a human voice attempting my name, but the phonetic structure of my name embedded in that warped, resonant howl. Multiple layers of sound seeming to emanate from a single source, like someone playing different recordings of the same word simultaneously at slightly different pitches. I radioed for additional information about the previous trespassing incidents. Kia told me they'd finally had someone investigate the symbolic carvings, but the investigator had found nothing unusual about them, possibly just a Boy Scout group or a local hiking club, though they could find no record of any scheduled activity. The Park Service was satisfied that the issue was resolved. They weren't satisfied I was being watched, and the thing doing the watching was learning. By mid-September, the forest near the cabin began to feel different. Not hostile exactly, but aware. I would catch movement in my peripheral vision, dark shapes between trees, figures that dissolved into shadow when I tried to focus on them. Twice I found animal carcasses near the cabin property, both of them posed deliberately. A deer, laid out straight with its legs arranged in an unnatural symmetry. A rabbit, positioned upright against a tree trunk with its head turned at an impossible angle. Neither showed signs of predation. Neither had begun to decompose in the ways that indicated they'd been dead for long. They were arrangements, messages. The National Interagency Fire Center, where I'd studied for my ranger position, had taught us about bear behavior, elk migration patterns, the feeding habits of mountain lions. Nothing had prepared me for the realization that something was attempting communication, and that whatever it was had decided I needed to understand its presence through psychological escalation rather than direct confrontation. I increased my paranoia methodically, which was probably the healthiest response I could have managed. I checked the cabin's locks before dark. I left external lights on through the night, burning through fuel for the generator at an unsustainable rate. I kept my loaded pistol on the nightstand and a rifle mounted above the kitchen door. I recorded everything in my journal and submitted careful, measured reports to Kia that didn't adequately convey my growing certainty that something in the forest was no longer content to remain at a distance. The lake itself had changed. The water had taken on a greenish tint that hadn't been present in August, though my water samples showed nothing harmful. The algae blooms sometimes came early in certain conditions, but Kia confirmed that no other areas of the park had documented similar growth patterns. It was localized to Badger Lake, concentrated in the deeper regions that I couldn't reach from the dock without a boat. I didn't have a boat. The previous ranger hadn't needed one. I made a note to request one in my next supply delivery. September 21st was the night everything crystallized into absolute terror. I was inside the cabin attempting to read, something I'd been unable to focus on for days. The book was a property management manual from the 1970s that I'd found on the station's shelf, left over from some previous ranger. The words weren't penetrating. I was simply occupying my eyes and attention with something to pretend normalcy. The calling that night was different. It didn't come from across the lake. It came from immediately outside the cabin, circling the perimeter. Whatever was making the sound moved with an unsettling efficiency, completing a circuit around my shelter every 3 to 4 minutes. I sat in the middle of the cabin with every light on, the rifle across my lap, counting the passages. After the 4th circuit, the calling stopped. The silence that followed was so profound it seemed to have weight. Then, the knocking. It came at the cabin door with measured, deliberate strikes. Not frantic, not aggressive in the way an animal would be aggressive. Polite knocking, the kind of knocking a visitor makes. 3 knocks, pause, 3 more knocks. I didn't respond. The knocking continued, patiently, for what might have been 5 minutes before stopping. When I finally gathered the courage to look out the window, what I saw in the moonlight made the world tilt. A figure stood at the dock, silhouetted against the pale water. It was humanoid, roughly man-sized, but nothing about its proportions suggested human anatomy. The shoulders were too broad, the arms too long, the way it stood somehow wrong in a manner I couldn't articulate. It was motionless, and I understood with absolute certainty that it could see me watching from the window, that it had intended for me to see it. As I watched, the figure tilted its head. The motion was smooth, controlled, a full 180-degree turn that no human neck could achieve. For just a moment, I thought I saw a face, or something approximating a face, features that seemed familiar and yet profoundly alien. My own features, maybe, or an interpretation of them by something that had learned what I looked like but didn't quite understand how human anatomy was supposed to work. Then it turned and walked into the lake, not away from the dock, not to the side. Straight out into the water, moving with a deliberate pace that never altered despite the depth increasing. I watched until the dark water closed over its head. I waited for it to emerge. It didn't. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the cabin with every light burning, the rifle loaded, my hand shaking. By dawn, my hand had stopped shaking, but something more fundamental had broken. I knew what was watching me. Not the exact nature of it, not its true form or purpose, but its intent. It wasn't going to kill me, not yet. First, it was going to ensure I understood something about the nature of this place. The previous ranger had written, "It's learning what we look like." I finally understood what he meant. I radioed Kia at 7 a.m. requesting immediate evacuation. She could hear something wrong in my voice because she didn't question it. She said it would take at least 3 hours for someone to reach me, maybe longer depending on the condition of the access road. She asked if I was in physical danger. Yes, I said. It was the most honest answer I could have given. The ranger who arrived at 10:30 a.m. was a man named Victor, younger than me, with the kind of relaxed confidence that came from working in the developed areas of the park where the dangers were known and cataloged. He looked around the cabin, checked the records I'd kept, and listened to my explanation with polite skepticism barely concealed. "You've been isolated out here for 6 weeks, he said carefully. "That's a lot of time to let your imagination work in a place like this." I couldn't argue. I sounded insane. I knew how I sounded. I left Glacier National Park that day and submitted my resignation effective immediately. The Park Service wasn't thrilled, but they accepted it. I filed my final report, documenting the trespassing incidents, the symbolic carvings, the unusual wildlife behavior, and the psychological stress of extreme isolation. The report was careful, neutral, constructed in such a way that it didn't actually demand belief in anything beyond the documented facts. What I didn't put in the official report was the subsequent investigation that Victor conducted while I packed my belongings. He found nothing, no tracks, no evidence of the figure, no explanation for the marked trees or the posed animals. When he searched the lake, he found nothing unusual. The water's greenish tint, he explained, was consistent with a late-season algae bloom and not indicative of any actual problem. I left the cabin at 2 p.m. on September 22nd. The drive down the access road felt like escaping a pressure chamber. By the time I reached the main park roads, my breathing had almost returned to normal. Almost. That was 3 months ago. I'm back in the city now, working a desk job for the National Park Service, processing applications and scheduling tours. It's mind-numbing work that I'm grateful for, because it occupies enough of my attention to prevent me from thinking too deeply about what I experienced. But I still keep records. I still documented everything I remember about those 6 weeks. And I've been following the Park Service communications channels, monitoring for reports from Badger Creek Station. The new ranger at the station is a woman named Iris, 32 years old, previously worked in Yosemite. She's been there for almost 6 weeks now. Her check-ins are normal, professional, routine, but last week, she submitted a request for additional lighting equipment and a generator upgrade to support increased power usage. The request included a note about behavioral observations of local wildlife requiring additional documentation. 2 days ago, I received a message on an old email address I'd used during my tenure. No sender information, just text. I understand now why you left. I'm beginning to understand what it's learning. It's been here a long time, watching, waiting for someone to stay long enough to understand. I'm that person. I don't know if I can leave. I didn't respond. I couldn't. There was nothing I could say that would help her understand that the only way to survive what waits at Badger Lake is to accept that some places in the wilderness are not meant for human habitation. Some locations have their own purposes, their own intelligence. We can visit them, catalog them, try to manage them. But if something there decides it's interested in you, in studying you, in learning what you look like and how you think, then your best option is to remove yourself from the equation entirely. The station logs from 1997 through 2003 have been digitized and are available through the Park Service's internal database. I read through them all, every entry from every ranger who ever worked at Badger Creek. The names change, the styles of documentation evolve, but the patterns remain consistent. August and September entries become more frequent over time. References to strange sounds, unusual animal behavior, inexplicable phenomena. The entries stop being routine and start being desperate. Each ranger's tenure at Badger Creek became progressively shorter. The ranger before my immediate predecessor lasted only 3 weeks. The one before that lasted 2 weeks. The entries from 2003 show a ranger named Garrett who spent 8 days at the station before requesting reassignment. His final entry, dated in the middle of his second night, consists of a single line. It showed me my face but wrong. Not a reflection, not a distortion. A perfect copy but arranged differently. I think it showed me what I look like when I'm not myself anymore. I need to leave. Iris is on day 42 at Badger Creek. I check the communication logs daily. I'm not sure what I'm looking for, some indication that she's safe, or some evidence that the process has reached its conclusion. The thing at Badger Lake has a pattern. It observes, it learns, it communicates. And eventually it forces the person it has chosen to understand that the cabin, the lake, and the forest exist in a state that is fundamentally incompatible with human occupation. Sometimes I wonder if it's still learning, if it extracted everything of value from the rangers who came before, or if each person who stays provides it with new information, some new variation on what it means to be human. Something that helps it perfect whatever this process is. I think about the previous ranger's final note. It's learning what we look like. I wonder if it's also learning why we run. The position at Badger Creek Ranger Station is being posted again for the 2025 season. Applications are open. There's a note about its remote location and the need for mental stability and experience with isolation. Applicants are asked to explain why they're seeking such a challenging posting. I won't be reapplying, but someone will. Someone looking for isolation, running from their own version of themselves, thinking they need the solitude of a remote mountain cabin and a dark lake to find peace. They'll arrive in July full of purpose and relief. They'll establish a routine, and sometime in August or September, they'll begin to hear sounds from across the water. They'll find the remains of previous campfires, the carved symbols in the trees, They'll start to understand that they're being observed, cataloged, slowly repositioned until they can no longer distinguish between the forest and themselves. And hopefully, before the process reaches its conclusion, they'll have the good sense to leave. But some won't. Some will stay, frozen by curiosity or fear or the sinking realization that their resignation might not actually be accepted. Some will remain at Badger Creek Station, watching the lake, waiting for the thing that has learned what they look like to finally show them why it needed to know. There are gaps in the station's logs from certain years. Entire months of missing entries where rangers either failed to file reports or the records were destroyed. I've requested access to the historical documents, hoping to find some explanation, some indication of what happened to the people who disappeared from the record entirely. The requests are still pending. I still check my email, waiting for another message from Iris. If it comes, I won't respond. There's nothing to say to someone who has been marked by Badger Lake. The only mercy I can offer is silence and the small hope that she finds the strength to walk away before it's too late. But I suspect she won't. I suspect that by the time she fully understands what's happening, she'll find that something has changed in the way she thinks about leaving, and she'll remain at the station through the fall and into the winter, telling herself that she'll go soon, that she just needs a few more weeks to understand what she's witnessing. By spring, there will be a new ranger assigned to Badger Creek, and the lake will wait, patient and eternal, for the next person who needs isolation badly enough to ignore what a careful reading of the records would reveal. It's learning what we look like, and it's never going to stop. My name is Raven Blackthorn, and I've been a ranger at Glacier National Park for 7 months now. People always ask what drew me to this particular assignment, to this remote posting at the northern edge of Montana where winter comes early and stays late. The truth isn't a simple story. It's wrapped in the kind of loss that changes how you see the world. I was living in Denver before, working for the Forest Service, running a comfortable desk job that paid well and demanded nothing of my soul. My sister Iris had disappeared during a hiking trip in the San Juan Mountains 3 years earlier. The search lasted 6 weeks. They found her jacket near a ravine, but nothing else. The official report said she'd fallen, that her body was lost somewhere in the canyonlands below. My family accepted this explanation. I never could. I left Denver to find solitude, to understand why my sister vanished, and maybe to find some kind of answer in places where mountains still keep their secrets. A position opened up at Glacier, one of the most remote ranger stations in the park. I took it without much consideration. I needed to be where civilization ends, where the radio signals are weak and help is measured in hours rather than minutes. The cabin they assigned me sits 3 miles from the nearest trail, nestled between 2 ridges at the edge of Lake McDonald's northern shore. It's small, maybe 800 square feet, with a wood stove that drafts poorly and a radio that crackles with static more than actual communication. The isolation suits me, or it did, until I started finding the marks. The job itself is straightforward. I patrol the backcountry, maintain trails, assist lost hikers, document wildlife patterns, and report anything unusual to the main station in St. Mary. In summer, the work is manageable. Tourists come, they hike, they take their photographs, they leave. In winter, I'm mostly alone, which is exactly what I wanted. I arrived in March, when the snow still covered everything above 5,000 feet. The landscape was silent in a way that only high mountains can be, not peaceful silence, but an empty kind of quiet that makes you aware of your own heartbeat. The cabin had been closed for 4 months. When I opened the door, the air inside tasted stale and cold, like breathing into a tomb. My predecessor, a man named Garrett Wells, had left 6 months earlier. According to the reports, he'd served 3 seasons without incident. He simply asked for a transfer one day, cited personal reasons, and left without elaborating. I later learned that he'd barely spoken to anyone during his final weeks. The few interactions documented in the log showed him growing increasingly tense, requesting supply runs more frequently, working longer days. During my first weeks, I found his notes scattered throughout the cabin. Nothing official, just loose papers shoved into drawers. Most of them were illegible, written in a handwriting that deteriorated as the pages went on. One entry, dated from his final week, read, "They know I'm leaving. I can feel them knowing. It's not paranoia if they're actually there." I threw the papers away. I thought he'd been experiencing some kind of breakdown, overwhelmed by the isolation. Now, I understand he was trying to warn me. The first month passed without incident. I settled into the routine, fixed the stove, repaired sections of fence around the perimeter, and began the trail maintenance work. The lake became familiar, its moods shifting with the weather. On calm days it reflected the mountains perfectly, creating this uncanny mirror of the peaks above. On stormy days it churned gray and violent, its surface broken by wind-driven waves. In late April, I found the first dead animal. It was a mountain goat, partially decomposed, lying in the shallows near the eastern shore. I wouldn't have noticed it except for the smell that drifted inland with the wind. The carcass had been there for several days, maybe a week. What struck me wasn't just that it was dead, but how it had died. Its rear legs were missing. Not like a predator kill, where bones would be scattered, sinews torn. The legs were cleanly gone, as if removed with deliberate precision. The blood around the stump had dried to a dark crust, and the body showed no other marks of violence. I documented it, took photographs, and reported it via radio to the station. The response was professional but dismissive. Bears had been active in the region. Perhaps it had been injured, fallen into the lake, and the carcass had been further mutilated by scavengers. They said they'd send someone to investigate within the week. No one ever came. Over the next several weeks, I found more remains. An elk calf burned so severely that most of its flesh had blackened. A deer, positioned deliberately with its head turned 180 degrees, its neck unbroken. A badger, which I found completely intact except that its eyes were missing and something had been carved into its side. I took rubbings of the carving with charcoal and paper. The marks didn't correspond to any animal pattern I could identify. By June, I was finding at least one body every few days. I reported each one meticulously, but the responses from the station grew increasingly dismissive. They suggested I was overestimating the occurrence, that I was looking for patterns where none existed. One supervisor actually insinuated that I might be causing the injuries myself and reporting them for attention. I stopped reporting after that. The animals found around the lake exhibited similar characteristics. Mutilation that seemed purposeful, placement that suggested intention rather than chance. Some showed signs of having been flayed. Others had parts removed with such precision that I began to wonder if whoever or whatever was doing this had practiced. Then came the night in late June when I heard something that changed everything. I was sitting on the porch around midnight, reading by lamplight, when the sound started. It began as a low howl, the kind that coyotes make in the winter months when hunger drives them down from the higher elevations. But June was summer. Coyotes weren't active this way in summer. And as I listened, the howl shifted, transforming into something that shared no similarity with any animal I'd ever heard. It was a vocal sound, constructed of multiple layers. Underneath the initial howl was something that almost resembled words, syllables arranged in a cadence that suggested intentional communication. The sound came from the ridge above the cabin, from the thick forest where my patrols rarely took me. I went inside and locked the door. This was my first mistake, because locking the door gave the fear a focus, a validation. If nothing were wrong, I wouldn't need to lock it. But I did, and I turned off the porch light, and I sat in darkness listening to that sound escalate. It lasted for 2 hours. Other voices joined the first, each distinct but somehow harmonized with the others, as if they were responding to calls and countercalls in a conversation I couldn't understand. The sound didn't move closer or farther away. It simply existed on that ridge, this invisible choir performing a composition designed to unsettle. By the time it faded, around 2 in the morning, I was shaking. I told myself it was coyotes or possibly wolves. Bears can vocalize in ways people don't expect. I made coffee and sat at the table, watching the darkness outside the windows. In the morning, I hiked up the ridge. The forest above the cabin is old growth, with trees that predate European contact. The canopy is so dense that even at midday, little light reaches the forest floor. I moved carefully, trying to spot whatever had made that sound. I found nothing unusual. No tracks, no scat, no evidence of large animal activity. What I did find, near the summit of the ridge, was a clearing. It wasn't a natural clearing. The trees surrounding it had been deliberately stripped of their bark, something that would have required tremendous strength and purpose. The bark lay in neat piles, weathered and decomposing. In the center of the clearing were bones, dozens of them, arranged in a pattern that suggested some kind of structure. Skulls from various animals, including multiple deer and a bear. The arrangement was old, the bones weathered and gray, some of them so fragile they crumbled when I carefully picked them up to examine them. But there were fresh bones too. The remains from the animals I'd found were here, their placement within the circle suggesting they were part of an ongoing collection. The human spine immediately went cold. Someone was doing this. A person had built this structure, was maintaining it, was using this clearing as a kind of killing ground. I took photographs, marked the GPS coordinates, and returned to the cabin. This time, when I radioed the station, I was direct and urgent. I reported the clearing, the bones, the pattern of animal deaths. The response came from Supervisor Reeves, a man I'd dealt with several times before. His tone shifted immediately. He told me to stay at the cabin, told me to lock the doors, and told him he was sending a team out the next day. They arrived around noon the following afternoon. 3 rangers, including Reeves himself and a wildlife biologist named Dr. Marcus Chen. The 5 of us hiked up to the ridge. As we approached the clearing, I felt a knot of anxiety in my chest. What if I'd imagined it? What if the stress and isolation had created false memories? The clearing was still there. The bones were still arranged exactly as I'd left them, but something was different. The arrangement had been revised. The bones that had been positioned in a careful circle were now scattered, as if something had disturbed the site during the night, and new remains had been added. Fresh remains. A large dog lay in the center of the clearing, its body still warm. It had been killed recently, probably within the last few hours. Its throat had been torn open, and the blood was still bright red. The shock on the faces of the rangers was clear. Reeves actually stepped backward, his hand going to the radio on his belt. Dr. Chen approached the body slowly, examining it with a clinical attention that contrasted sharply with the grotesqueness of the scene. "How long was this here before you came up?" Reeves asked. "It wasn't," I said. "This is new. It wasn't here yesterday." Reeves looked at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Are you certain?" "Absolutely certain." The investigation that followed was thorough, but ultimately inconclusive. The dog was identified as belonging to one of the hikers who'd been camping about 2 miles north of my position. A search revealed no evidence of human involvement. No footprints, no tool marks, nothing that suggested a person had killed the animal. The arrangement of bones was deemed likely the work of an obsessive individual, but the rangers couldn't determine who. What troubled them most was the question of the clearing itself. There was no obvious explanation for how it had been established or maintained without leaving more obvious signs of human activity. Reeves suggested that perhaps it was a location where natural predators had been feeding for months or years, with the bones accumulating gradually. Dr. Chen didn't agree, but he didn't offer an alternative theory. By evening, they were gone. Reeves told me to report any further incidents immediately and to carry a sidearm when I was patrolling. They left me with a 9mm pistol which I holstered but didn't know how to use with any real competence. The weight of it felt both reassuring and utterly useless. That night, I heard the sounds again. This time, they came from all directions. Multiple voices, sometimes overlapping, sometimes calling in sequence. The vocalizations were different from the previous night, more complex and urgent. I realized with a clarity that felt almost crystalline that whatever was making these sounds was aware of the investigation. The voices carried a quality that resembled frustration, or possibly anger. Around 3 in the morning, something hit the cabin. It struck the east wall with enough force to crack the wooden structure. I heard the sound of splitting wood and the sharp report of something large impacting solid material. I grabbed the pistol and checked the windows. The darkness outside was absolute, unrelenting. "Who's there?" I shouted, immediately regretting the question. The response came as a sound outside the window. Something that might have been laughter if laughter could be formed without any of the parameters of human vocal anatomy. I spent the rest of the night sitting in the center of the cabin with all the lights on and the pistol in my trembling hands. By early July, my situation had become genuinely precarious. The incidents were escalating. Objects were moving around the cabin at night. Tools disappeared and reappeared in different locations. Scratch marks appeared on the exterior walls, focused around the windows and door. The sounds continued every night, sometimes for hours, a constant presence that prevented sleep. I was functioning on perhaps 2 hours of actual rest per night, sustained by coffee and a dread that had become the baseline of my existence. The park station had grown concerned about my condition. They'd sent a wellness check, and the ranger who came out seemed convinced that I was experiencing some kind of psychiatric breakdown. I couldn't blame him. I looked terrible. I hadn't shaved in 2 weeks. My hands trembled constantly, but I knew what I was experiencing was real. I also knew that something fundamental had changed after the investigation. Whatever was making those sounds, whatever had built that clearing, was no longer content to simply exist nearby. It had become aware of my awareness, and it was testing the boundaries of what I would do in response. It was during this period that I first considered the possibility that I was dealing with something that didn't fit standard categories. I found myself researching Native American folklore during the day, reading accounts of experiences that paralleled my own. There were stories of beings that weren't quite animal, that moved with intention and purpose beyond the scope of instinct. Stories of shape-shifting entities that took forms designed to unsettle, to challenge the boundary between human and animal understanding. The term skinwalker kept appearing in these accounts, from Navajo tradition, but referenced across multiple cultures with different names and slightly different characteristics. The descriptions varied, but the core concepts remained constant. Beings that had crossed some threshold, that had abandoned their original nature to become something other, something predatory. I wasn't a believer in the supernatural. I'd been raised in an agnostic family and had maintained a rational approach to the world. But rationality was becoming difficult to maintain in the face of evidence that didn't align with my understanding of what was possible. On the night of July 3rd, everything changed. I was sitting at the table, laptop open to some research article I was trying to concentrate on, when I heard a different sound. Not the vocalizations this time, but movement. Something large was circling the cabin. I could hear it breathing, a rasping, congested sound that suggested damaged lungs. The footsteps were heavy but careful, placing weight deliberately to minimize noise. I grabbed the pistol and moved to the window. What I saw was the most disturbing thing I experienced during my entire time at that cabin. The creature silhouetted against the moonlight was approximately humanoid in shape, but everything about it was fundamentally wrong. Its proportions were off, the limbs too long and angled in ways that seemed to bend in directions that human joints shouldn't allow. It moved in a way that was neither fully quadrupedal nor bipedal, a hybrid motion that suggested something trying to move using anatomy it hadn't fully adapted to. The face, when it turned toward the window where I was watching, was the worst part. It was almost human, but the features were distributed incorrectly. The eyes were too close together and reflected the moonlight with a wet, animal quality. The mouth extended too far across the skull, and I could see teeth that weren't arranged like teeth should be. I fired without thinking. The pistol bucked in my hand. The recoil sent a shock through my wrist, and the sound was deafening in the cabin. The creature made a sound that I can only describe as a shriek, and it moved away from the window with a speed that shouldn't have been possible for something of its apparent size and bulk. I fired twice more, out through the window, into the darkness where it had gone. The glass exploded outward, and I could hear the creature crashing through the forest, its movements no longer careful or controlled. Then silence. An absolute, dead silence that lasted for what might have been minutes or might have been hours. I sat in the cabin with the pistol still in my hand, breathing in ragged gasps. The window was completely gone now, just a rectangular opening to the darkness beyond. The wind came through, carrying the smell of pine and something else, something organic and profoundly unclean. By morning I had made my decision. I packed a bag with essential items, left a detailed report on the table, and called the station. I told them I needed immediate extraction. I said I had encountered something that I believed was dangerous and that I could no longer safely remain at the cabin. The response was complicated. Reeves wanted to send a team, wanted me to remain at the cabin and document further incidents. But my tone must have convinced him that this wasn't negotiable. By evening, a helicopter arrived. I left the cabin and didn't look back. I spent 2 weeks at the main station in St. Mary, working with Dr. Chen and several behavioral scientists who had been brought in to evaluate my account. They interviewed me extensively, recorded my observations, and examined the photographs I'd taken. Reeves was professional but clearly skeptical. The wounds on my psyche were obvious enough that psychiatric evaluation was inevitable. What saved me was the dog. The dead dog from the clearing had been properly examined by a veterinary pathologist. The injuries were consistent with predation, certainly, but the pattern of the wounds was unusual. The throat had been torn open, yes, but with a deliberation that suggested something other than a simple predatory strike. And there were marks on the carcass that the pathologist had flagged as potentially made by human hands. The implications of this finding shifted the investigation from my psychological condition to a potential criminal matter. Over the next 10 days, rangers and investigators combed through the files more carefully. It turned out that Garrett Wells, my predecessor, had actually submitted a detailed report to regional office 6 months earlier. I'd never been shown this report. It documented animal mutilations, strange sounds, and evidence of what Wells believed was a sentient, non-human presence at the lake. His language was carefully clinical, but the implications were clear. His transfer hadn't been simply due to burnout. Regional management had quietly determined that he was experiencing a concerning separation from reality and had encouraged him to take medical leave. But the file also contained a recommendation that the cabin be closed during off-season months, and that a new ranger not be assigned until the issues could be properly investigated. That recommendation had been ignored. The oversight that led to my assignment, combined with the evidence now being examined, created enough official concern that the Park Service initiated a comprehensive investigation. They brought in hunters, biologists, and a team of forensic specialists who literally combed the area around the cabin and the ridge. What they found was both enlightening and deeply troubling. The clearing contained evidence of long-term human occupation. Artifacts were recovered that suggested use spanning decades, possibly much longer. They found burnt bone, charred wood, and implements crafted from materials that didn't match any standard tool-making tradition they recognized. Carbon dating suggested the most recent use was within the last year, but older layers went back much further. They also found something that no one wanted to discuss openly: a grave. It was buried near the edge of the clearing, and the remains inside were human. The bones were old, scattered, and not fully preserved, but they were unmistakably human. The official report listed it as a historical site that might relate to indigenous peoples or early settlers. But the way the bones were arranged, the careful positioning, suggested they hadn't been there due to a simple death or burial. What they recovered from the site suggested something far more intentional. The investigation expanded significantly after this discovery. State police became involved. The FBI reviewed the evidence, though they were cautious about drawing any formal conclusions. The official finding was that the clearing appeared to be a location with historical significance that required further study, and that the animal mutilations were likely the result of a predator with unusual behavior patterns, potentially a predator with access to tools or with human assistance. But I could see it in the faces of the rangers who'd seen the site, in the way they avoided certain topics during debriefing sessions. They'd found evidence that something was wrong with standard explanations, and they didn't know how to proceed. I was offered a position at a different park. I refused. I was offered administrative work. I refused. I took a leave of absence instead, which turned into a resignation. By late August, I was back in Denver. I tried to resume a normal life. I rented an apartment, started looking for work, attempted to process what I'd experienced. But something had shifted in me, fundamentally altered by those months at Glacier. I couldn't be around people without feeling a distinct sense of displacement, as if I'd seen something about the world that ordinary people remained blissfully unaware of, and I began to understand what had happened to Garrett Wells. I contacted him through a social media platform. It took some searching, but I finally found a profile that seemed to match his age and location. I sent him a message saying I'd worked at the cabin after him, that I'd experienced similar phenomena, that I wanted to talk. His response came 4 days later. He agreed to meet me at a coffee shop in Boulder, Colorado, where he was apparently living in semi-retirement, working part-time at a bookstore. When I saw him in person, the toll of his time at the cabin was evident. He was thin and moved carefully, as if his body caused him constant pain. His eyes had a quality I recognized in my own reflection. "You saw them?" he asked before I'd even sat down. I nodded. "I saw something." "You saw them?" he repeated. It wasn't a question this time. Over the next several hours, Garrett told me his account. He described similar progression of events, the animal mutilations, the sounds, the clearing. But he also described something I hadn't directly experienced yet, a level of sophistication in their communication that suggested something with intelligence that went beyond animal instinct. "They wanted me to understand that they were there," Garrett explained. "Not hunting me necessarily, but present, making me aware of them. It was like they were testing to see how I would respond, what I would do if I knew about them." "What made you leave?" I asked. His expression shifted, became distant. "I realized they were hurting people. I found evidence that they were manipulating hikers, guiding lost people into areas where they could observe them. I found notes, actual written notes, left where I would find them, written in English." I felt a chill run through me. Garrett continued. "That's when I understood it wasn't about predation in any simple sense. It was about interaction. They wanted to interact with us, to study us, maybe to understand us. The thought that something was using intelligence to deliberately stalk people, to study them. I couldn't handle that, so I requested a transfer and I left." "Have you ever been back?" I asked. "No," Garrett said. "But I've talked to others, rangers from other parks, from other remote locations. There are patterns, similar incidents at Yellowstone. Something strange reported at Olympic Park. Wildlife management people in Alaska have documented impossible predation patterns. It's not widely discussed, but if you know who to talk to, you start hearing the same story over and over. What do they want? I asked. Garrett looked at me for a long moment. I don't think anyone knows. But I think what they want might be less important than acknowledging that they exist, that they're aware of us, and that they're observing us with purposes we can't fully comprehend. It's been 4 months since I left Glacier. I'm writing this account in a small apartment in Fort Collins, knowing that I'll never have a satisfying conclusion. I'll never be able to explain what I experienced in terms that would convince a skeptic, and I no longer care. The skeptics serve an important function. They provide a baseline. They maintain the boundary between accepted reality and the territories that lie beyond it. But that boundary exists for a reason, and that reason is that some things live in those territories. I've received 2 pieces of correspondence in recent weeks that I think are worth noting. The first was a letter from the Park Service officially closing the investigation into the glacier incidents. They concluded that the clearing was likely an indigenous historical site that had been misinterpreted, and that the animal mutilations were consistent with natural predation patterns that had been statistically abnormal but not impossible. The human remains were determined to be archaeologically significant and were reburied according to protocols developed with tribal authorities. The case was closed. Official reality reasserted itself. The second correspondence came in the form of an email. It was from an address I didn't recognize, containing only a short message. The lake watches. The mountains remember. They know about Iris. I don't know how they knew my sister's name. I don't know how the message was sent or by whom. I've considered the possibility that it's some form of elaborate hoax, but the specificity of the reference, the knowledge of personal details that weren't public record, suggests otherwise. My sister vanished in the San Juan Mountains. Those mountains are roughly 350 miles south of Glacier National Park. There's no geographical proximity, but now I wonder if there's a deeper connection. I wonder if my time at that cabin wasn't about chance or coincidence, but about something drawing me there, making me aware of its presence. I've started researching disappearances in remote wilderness areas. The numbers are staggering. Every year, hundreds of people go missing in national parks and protected lands. Some are found, many are not. The official explanations range from accident to misadventure to voluntary disappearance. But what if some of those people were found by something other than rescue teams? What if some of them were observed, studied, and taken to locations where their fates became something other than recovery? I'm not equipped to answer these questions. I'm just a man who spent 4 months in an isolated cabin and saw something that shouldn't exist in any rational framework. I return to a world that demands explanations, and I have none that would satisfy. What I have instead is knowledge, the knowledge that something vast and patient and intelligent exists in the wild places that humans think they understand. Something that moves through the forest with purposeful awareness. Something that has learned our language and our habits. Something that watches. If you're reading this account, and if you've experienced something similar, then you understand. You know what it means to see beyond the accepted boundaries of reality. You know what it costs to maintain that knowledge in a world that would prefer you remain ignorant. The mountains are patient. The forests are watching, and somewhere beyond the ridge, in a clearing built from generations of collected bones, something continues its work. It observes, it studies, it waits. I don't know if what I encountered was a skinwalker in the traditional sense. I don't know if it was something older, something that predates the term. I know only that it was aware of me, and that in some fundamental way the encounter changed the trajectory of my life. The most disturbing realization I've come to is this: I'm not afraid anymore. Fear requires uncertainty, and I'm no longer uncertain. The fear has given way to something else, something closer to resignation, an understanding that there are realities beyond the ones we're taught to accept, and that once you've encountered those realities, you can never fully return to the comfortable fiction of a comprehensible world. My name is Raven Blackthorn, and this is my testimony. The mountains are still watching. My name is Kess Reeves, and I took this job because I needed to disappear. After the accident at the logging facility, after the lawsuit that took everything my family had, after I watched the news cameras catch me in the parking lot looking like some kind of criminal instead of someone who'd witnessed what others refused to see, I needed a place where nobody could find me, where nobody would want to. Glacier National Park, Montana, late autumn, a seasonal ranger position at a remote monitoring station near Kintla Lake. The job posting appeared in my inbox like providence. 2,000 acres of near isolation, minimal human contact, simple work-checking equipment and wildlife patterns. The cabin came with it. The loneliness was the point. I arrived in September, when the season was dying. The mountains were already shedding their green, trading it for rust and gold and the color of old bones. My supervisor, a man named Garrett, drove me up the logging road in a 1998 Ford that smelled like diesel and his cologne. He talked the entire way about bears being active and about how previous rangers had quit early, but he said it like a joke, like he couldn't imagine why anyone would leave paradise. The cabin sat on a rise overlooking the lake, a two-room structure built sometime in the 1970s from materials that had weathered into the color of driftwood. A bed, a table, a wood stove, a radio with spotty range, solar panels on the roof, a generator that ran on a schedule, a supply drop every 3 weeks from the main station 8 miles down the road. The water came from a hand pump that connected to a well. Everything else came from the forest. "You'll be fine," Garrett said, leaving me there in his dust. He called back from the truck window. "Radio in if anything strange happens." I didn't ask what he meant by strange. The first week was quiet. I fell into a routine, checking the wildlife cameras, recording temperature and precipitation data, maintaining the equipment that monitored air quality and stream flow. The work was simple, meditative. I sat on the porch at dawn, watching the lake steam as the sun climbed. At night, I listened to the woods settle into themselves, the sound of pine needles dropping, branches creaking as the temperature fell. The cabin was cold, but I kept the stove running through the evenings, feeding it wood I'd split in the first days there. Around day 10, I found the first deer. It wasn't unusual to find dead animals. That's what happened in nature, what always happened. But this one was positioned deliberately on the trail between the cabin and the primary equipment shed. Not just dead, but arranged. Its legs were crossed at unnatural angles and its head was turned completely around on its spine so its face pointed backward at its own body. The carcass had been there for days, long enough that insects had done their work, but not long enough that decomposition had taken it completely. I looked at it for a long time, trying to understand how this could happen. Predators didn't arrange their kills like this. Scavengers didn't straighten legs and snap spines into geometric angles. I buried it. The second one appeared 2 days later, on the opposite side of the cabin, in the small clearing where I'd stacked firewood. Another deer, another impossible positioning. This time its front hooves were driven into the bark of a birch tree, the animal hanging from a position it couldn't have reached on its own. I brought it down with an axe, my hands shaking more than the work required. By the time the third one appeared, I'd stopped trying to rationalize it. This one was an elk, young, maybe 2 years old. It had been left at the edge of the lake, and it hadn't been posed. It had simply been opened up, split from throat to tail in a single surgical cut. The water around it was stained brown. I called the radio, got no response except static that sounded like breathing, and I walked back to the cabin and locked the doors. The nights got longer. The sun was disappearing earlier now, and the quality of darkness changed. It wasn't the clean darkness of the forest, but something else, something that felt deliberate and present. I found myself checking the locks repeatedly. I found myself sleeping with a flashlight under my pillow, and a hunting knife on the table beside the bed. On the 15th night, I heard the screaming. It came from the lake, or from somewhere beyond the lake, a sound that started as an animal's cry and ended as something else entirely. Not a roar, not quite a howl, something that moved through registers a normal throat couldn't produce. It carried across the water and through the cabin walls, and I sat in the dark with my hands pressed against my ears, understanding with the kind of certainty that bypasses logic that something had changed. Something was here now, not passing through. Here. Staying. I tried the radio again. This time I got Garrett. "Is everything secure?" His voice was tight, different from before. "What's out there?" I asked. The static between his response was longer than the distance should have required. "Just stay inside. Keep the doors locked. Don't go to the lake. The water trucks will come for a supply run in 5 days. You can wait it out." "Wait what out?" "The presence," he said. And then something in the background, someone else's voice. And then he was gone. I stopped trying to sleep in the bed after a week of waking to sounds that didn't belong. Instead, I kept a chair by the stove and sat through the nights, the knife on my lap, watching the door and the windows with the kind of attention that starts to distort vision. I'd see movement in the glass that wasn't there, my own reflection becoming something other than myself when I wasn't looking directly at it. The supply drop didn't come. I rationed the food. I had enough for 3 weeks if I was careful, and I was very careful. I ate the canned vegetables slowly, drank the instant coffee weak, and saved the protein bars like currency. The water from the pump stayed on, though I began to notice a taste in it I hadn't noticed before. Something mineral and old, something that might have been the well trying to tell me something. On what I thought was day 22, I found the notebook. It was under the floorboards where the previous ranger had apparently kept things. A leather journal. The cover warped from moisture. The entries started 7 months ago, in the spring, before the seasonal position cycle that had hired me. I read it in the dark, using my flashlight, sitting so close to the stove I thought my pants might ignite. The first entries were normal. Weather observations, wildlife notes. Then, around late May, strange sounds at night. An elk killed in a manner that suggested intelligence. A feeling of being watched, even in the cabin. By June, the previous ranger, a woman named Riley, had noted a smell. Old, she wrote. Like nothing I've ever smelled in the woods. Like something from very deep time. Like skin that's been kept too warm and too damp. By July, she was writing about what she'd seen at the lake's edge. A figure that was tall when it wanted to be, and otherwise wrong. Angular in ways that nothing natural should be angular. She'd seen it move along the tree line at dusk, and she'd seen it run. Run on all fours, then on 2 legs, then on something that wasn't legs at all. By August, the entries had become fragmented. One page described scratch marks on the cabin's back wall, near where the window was. Another detailed the sounds it made, which she could somehow identify as something like language, something almost semantic. The final entry was dated August 17th. It's been singing. That's what I've been hearing. Not screaming, singing. But if that's singing, then singing is a method of stating things that shouldn't be stated, of making claims that the world isn't built to accommodate. I've heard it do mathematical things with its voice, heard it describe geometries that I can understand in the moment but can't remember after. This morning I looked at my hands and couldn't remember which fingers were which. It wore off after a few hours. I think it's been trying to communicate. I think it wants something. The last line was underlined 3 times. I'm leaving tomorrow. I don't care what Garrett says. The journal ended there. I checked the supply records on the radio and found that a water truck had come the next day. Riley had apparently gotten out. I wondered where she was now. I wondered if she'd ever told anyone, or if she'd decided, like I would soon decide, that telling people would be the fastest way to lose what credibility you had left. The voice started that night. It came through the walls. Not from outside, but through them, as if the barrier between inside and outside had become negotiable. It wasn't trying to scare me, I don't think. It sounded curious, almost gentle. It made sounds that were almost words, almost structures I could hang meaning on. One phrase repeated, variations of the same phonetic movement, variations of something like where, inside, where, inside. I pushed the table against the door and sat on it, the knife in my hands, trying to convince myself that a blade would make any difference if whatever was singing decided to push back. It didn't. The singing got quieter after I'd been crying for about 20 minutes, and by dawn it had stopped completely. The silence was worse. The silence meant it was close enough that it didn't need to use its voice anymore. On what might have been day 28, or day 30, or some other number I'd stopped maintaining with accuracy, I made a mistake that changed everything. I was out of fresh water. The pump had stopped working 3 days prior, producing nothing but a wet grinding sound and the smell I'd tasted in the water before. I had 2 bottles left, and I was rationing them to the degree that my mouth had developed a taste like copper. The lake was right there, 300 yards downslope. I could boil the water. The stove was hot. It would work. The first 3 trips were fine. I'd approach with the bucket held in both hands, fill it in under 30 seconds, and retreat to the cabin. Nothing happened. The lake was silent. The tree line was empty. I began to think maybe it had left. Maybe the cold coming in with September's death had driven it somewhere else, somewhere less hostile to the presence of prey that could think its way into cabin building. On the 4th trip, something was different. The water was warm, not warm like it had been heated, but warm like it was fever warm, like the lake had a temperature and that temperature was body temperature. I put my fingers in it and pulled them back immediately, but not before the water left traces on my skin. Traces that burned. The bucket I'd been carrying was still resting in the shallows, and I watched the water level rise slightly, not from my hand but from something underneath, something pushing from below. I backed away, didn't run, maintained a slow walk like you're supposed to around predators. Even though my legs wanted to sprint and my lungs wanted to scream, I made it 30 yards before I heard it. Not the singing this time, but a sound like something large moving through water. Moving fast. I turned and ran for the cabin, and I could hear it accelerating. Could hear the lake's surface break with something that was trying to leave water and approach land. I reached the porch. I got the door open. I dove through and kicked it shut, and something hit it from the outside so hard that the frame cracked. Just cracked. Didn't break. Just enough to show me that whatever was hitting it could control the force it applied, could choose to hit without destroying, which meant it could destroy if it wanted to. I moved the table back against the door, then moved the bed, then moved everything that could be moved. I created barriers, meaningless barriers. I sat in the corner near the stove, and I waited. The sounds came then, not attacking sounds but investigating sounds, something walking around the cabin's perimeter, slowly, deliberately. Noises at the window, not trying to break in but examining. I heard claws, or something like claws, scraping against the glass with a patience that was somehow worse than violence would have been. It spent an hour at the back window just scraping, not breaking, examining. When it spoke, the voice came through the wood itself. Inside where? Not a question, a statement. The voice was learning. It had been listening to the walls, to the sound of my breathing, to the language of panic. You inside where? Inside, warm where? Where have you been inside? I didn't realize I was answering until I heard my own voice. I'm inside because I'm afraid of you. There was a pause. The scraping stopped. For a moment, the world was quiet in a way that felt unnatural. You're afraid, it said, and each word was shaped differently now, pulled from whatever linguistic template it had constructed. I don't know fear. I only know hunger. I know the shape of warmth inside the cold things. I know that you are the warmest thing here. I have been trying to talk to you about this. What do you want? My voice sounded like it belonged to someone else. To know what you are, to understand. You have a language, you have structure, you have the same kind of thinking that some of the old ones had before they went into the mountains and became something else. Before the hunger ate them from inside out. I pressed my back harder against the wall. You're not going to eat me. No, it agreed. Not until you let me in. That's the rule. That's what the coldness taught us. You have to let things in. They have to choose. And I realized, with a clarity that felt like its own kind of hunger, that it was right. As long as I stayed in the cabin, kept the doors locked, maintained the barriers, it couldn't touch me. Not really, not in the way it wanted to. This was a game with rules, and the rules were predicated on violation by consent. It stayed outside all night, and we talked. I didn't sleep. I sat in the corner and answered its questions. It wanted to know about the world inside the cabin, about the things I had, the tools I'd built, the reasons I'd chosen this place. It wanted to know about electricity, how I'd convinced lightning to stay in the panels and follow my commands. It wanted to know about the stove, how I'd domesticated fire. It wanted to know about books, which it had found under the bed, and why I'd marked them with liquid, pointing at things that interested me. I answered. I told it about depression, about running away, about the weight of failure. I explained that the lightning in the panels wasn't lightning at all, but something harnessed from the sun. I told it that fire was just chemistry, that books were thoughts made solid. I think it understood in the way that something might understand a concept without understanding the underlying reality. The comprehension was partial, filtered through an intelligence that had grown sharp on hunger and isolation. The sun is warm, it said. I understand the sun. I live in places without the sun. Deep places, old places. Where are you from? I asked. Everywhere there is cold that has never known warmth. Everywhere that hunger lives because nothing lives. I've been many things. I've learned many ways to move, many ways to eat. Some of the shapes I've worn I've forgotten. Some of the tastes I've chased, I can't remember if they were real or just memory of memory of memory. Back to when I was new. The window cracked a little, and I flinched. But it didn't force the opening. It was just explaining the pressure it was applying, describing itself through metaphor. Why did you kill the animals? I asked. Because they were small versions of hunger. They were wrong. They were made of the kind of wanting that only understands meat. I was showing them what wanting could be. I was making them understand that there was something larger than them understanding. By dawn, I was making coffee. I don't know when I decided to do this, when the transition from fear to something else had happened, but I found myself moving in the kitchen, boiling water on the stove, using the instant coffee that Garrett had included in the supply drops. I made 2 cups. I left one by the back window. I'm giving you coffee, I said. I don't know if you can drink it." There was a long silence. Then the scraping sound started again, but different this time. A scraping that sounded like something shaping itself. Like something becoming capable of holding a cup with something like hands. "I can learn to drink it," it said finally. "I can learn to want it." We didn't talk about the hunters after that, but I knew they were coming. I knew from the way Garrett had sounded on the radio, from the fact that no more supply drops came, from the silence that had fallen over the region. I knew from the way my guest started positioning itself closer to the cabin each night, asking me more questions about fire, about light, about the way the interior of the cabin held warmth and refused to let the cold inside. On what I determined was day 35, I saw them. 2 trucks came down the logging road, and 4 people in khaki got out. Not rangers, hunters of something else entirely. They carried equipment I recognized from documentaries, the kind of equipment used for tracking things that weren't supposed to exist. They set up what looked like monitoring equipment around the cabin, creating a perimeter. My guest disappeared into the deep woods, and I could feel its absence like a weight. The hunters didn't try to break down the door. They knocked, politely, professionally. I recognized Garrett with them. Behind him was a woman in a government jacket, and 2 men with gear that screamed military efficiency. "Kess," Garrett said through the wood, "we need you to come out." "I'm not leaving," I called back. "We can protect you," the woman said. She had the tone of someone who believed her own words. "We can remove the threat." I looked at the coffee cup by the window. It was still there, untouched. "There's nothing to remove. We have documentation of multiple attacks, unexplained deaths, confirmed sightings going back 2 decades. We know it's here, and we know you've been communicating with it." I didn't ask how they knew, the woman continued. "If you cooperate, we can end this. We have tranquilizer protocols, tracking systems. We can take care of it and you can go back to your life." My life. The thing I'd come here to escape. "How long have you known it was here?" There was a silence. Garrett shifted his weight. "The facility was built to contain it," the woman admitted finally. "You weren't hired to monitor environmental data. You were hired to monitor the enclosure. To be a constant human presence to keep it grounded to this place. The cabin, the routine, your predictability, it keeps it satisfied. It keeps it from moving further into populated areas." I thought about this. I thought about Riley, who'd been in the same situation, who'd run, who probably hadn't understood until later what her role had been. "And if I leave, then we neutralize it," Garrett said. "We have the protocols. It's a last resort, obviously, but if the containment breaks, you'll kill it." I said, "We'll do what's necessary." I looked around the cabin, at the coffee cup, at the marks on the walls where claws had tested the wood, at the notebook of Riley's, at the journals of other rangers before her, all of them recording the presence, all of them understanding eventually that they were keepers of something, guardians of a door between the old world and the new one. "I'm not coming out," I said. There was commotion outside. I heard tools, equipment, the sound of someone setting up to force entry. I didn't try to stop them. Instead, I went to the back window and opened it, just slightly. My guest was waiting. It had taken a form closer to humanoid now, something that might pass for a person if you didn't look too carefully, if you didn't notice that the joints bent wrong and the movement had too many redundant angles. It looked at me with something that might have been gratitude. "They've come to put you in the deep places again," I said. "To hunt you back into the mountains. Will you let them?" it asked. I thought about the alternative. A life returned to the world that had nearly destroyed me. A return to surveillance and judgment and the weight of being considered damaged. I thought about Riley out there somewhere, probably never able to shake what she'd learned, never able to live in a house or eat warm food without remembering what it meant to be small and alone in the dark with hunger. "No," I said. "I won't." I heard the door frame splinter. I heard Garrett shouting orders. I kept my hand on the window frame and I pulled it open wider. My guest moved. Not fast, but decisively. Not violently, but with purpose. Its form shifted as it moved, becoming something that could absorb the shots the hunters fired, becoming something that could navigate the space between walls, something that could do the thing it had been asking about, how to let itself be invited inside. I don't remember everything clearly. I remember cold hands that weren't quite cold enough to be cold. I remember the sounds outside transforming from gunfire to something that echoed wrongly, as if the physics of the place had become negotiable. I remember my guest asking me the same question over and over, the phrase it had learned from listening through the walls. "Inside where? You let me inside where?" And me answering, Inside me, you're inside where I am. When the hunters broke through, they found me at the table, the coffee still brewing, waiting patiently for someone to sit with me and drink it. They found only me. My guest had gone beyond, into me, into the places where hunger and loneliness had already done its work. The hunters took me out and brought me to facilities I didn't know existed, ran tests I couldn't understand, asked questions I couldn't answer because I didn't speak their language anymore. Eventually they let me go, told me the threat had been removed, told me to rebuild my life. But every time I drink something hot, I taste what was in the lake. Every time I sit in darkness, I hear the old language, the geometry of wanting. And sometimes, late at night, I feel something move behind my eyes, something patient and ancient and deeply, eternally cold, waiting for the day the kindness I showed it might be returned. Some things once invited in, learn to stay quiet, but they never really leave, and the mountains never stop being hungry. My name is Meredith Crow, and I've been a ranger at Glacier National Park for 7 years. I know what people assume, that I took this job because I couldn't hack it elsewhere, or because I needed to disappear into the wilderness to escape something. The truth is far more specific, though no less desperate. I accepted the position after my husband died, not because grief demanded solitude, though it did, but because his final coherent words were about Glacier. He'd visited once as a child, and years later when the cancer was doing its work, he kept returning to that memory. The way the mountains cut the sky, the way water moved through the valleys. He died on a Tuesday morning in April, and by June I was submitting my application to the National Park Service. My supervisor, a methodical man named Kevin whose competence never translated into warmth, seemed puzzled by my hiring. My background was in administrative work, 7 years at a Denver nonprofit managing grants and budgets. I had no fieldwork experience, no mountaineering certification, nothing that qualified me beyond a willingness that bordered on recklessness. But they were understaffed that season, and perhaps Kevin saw something in my eyes that suggested I wouldn't quit, that I had nowhere else to be. I was assigned to a remote station 5 miles north of Lake Kintla, which sits in a crescent of peaks like a dark eye watching the mountains that surround it. My cabin was built in 1987, updated minimally since. It had a wood stove, a propane oven, a well that worked most of the time, and enough solar batteries to power essentials if I managed consumption carefully. The nearest other ranger station was 12 miles south. The nearest town, West Glacier, was 38 miles away. That first week, the isolation felt like mercy. My primary responsibilities were straightforward: monitor wildlife populations, maintain the trail system, respond to emergency calls on the radio, and provide information to the handful of day hikers who ventured into the northern wilderness. The radio worked inconsistently, crackling with interference from the peaks. I learned quickly to make my reports early in the day, when atmospheric conditions favored transmission. The cabin sat 300 yards from the lakeshore, positioned on a slight rise that allowed me to see the water and the valley floor before it. The trees here were subalpine fir and lodgepole pine, dense enough to create perpetual twilight in the forest, but open enough at the water's edge to allow the last sun of each day to illuminate the lake in shades of amber and rust. I spent my first month mapping trails, learning the wildlife patterns, understanding the rhythms of a place that had its own logic entirely separate from human time. In late June, a family of black bears, a sow and 3 cubs, began frequenting the area near my cabin. This wasn't unusual. Bear activity picked up in summer as vegetation ripened and caloric demands increased. I followed protocol, secured my food stores in bear-proof containers, made noise when moving around the cabin, carried bear spray. I kept detailed observations in my logbook, noting their patterns, their apparent health, their movements. The sow was identifiable by a scar that bisected her left ear, likely from a territorial dispute years prior. I designated her as BC7 in my reports, though privately I had already named her Kemme, which in an Salish language I'd learned from a museum book means secret. She was methodical in her approach to foraging, moving through the berries and vegetation with the focused intensity of an engineer following blueprints. What I noticed first, in mid-July, was the change in their movement patterns. Bears are creatures of habit. They establish feeding routes, denning areas, rest patterns. Kemme had been moving in roughly the same circuit for weeks, down to the lakeshore in early morning, through the berry patches by midday, resting in a thicket by evening. But in the 3rd week of July, this pattern collapsed. She would appear at strange hours. 3 a.m., standing at the forest edge facing the cabin, 2 p.m., when she should have been resting, at the lake's northern edge, staring into the water without drinking. I documented everything. My ranger training included making observations about aberrant wildlife behavior, though the course materials assumed abnormality meant aggression or illness. They hadn't anticipated this purposefulness that seemed somehow conscious, even calculated. Kame was moving with intention, but toward no identifiable goal. It was as if she were searching for something, or following something I couldn't perceive. The cubs still followed her, their natural playfulness increasingly subdued. Cubs that age should have been wrestling, practicing hunting techniques, maintaining the social dynamics of a family unit. Instead, they moved with the grim determination of their mother, clustering close, their ears constantly rotating toward sounds I couldn't hear. I increased my radio reports, trying to describe the behavior in terms that wouldn't make me sound unstable. Wildlife patterns show unusual temporal distribution. Recommend increased monitoring. Kevin's response was typically bureaucratic. Note in official log. Continue standard observations. By August, other animals had begun exhibiting the same behavioral shift. A group of 3 mule deer started appearing at the cabin's clearing in the deepest part of night, standing motionless in the moonlight staring toward the forest. An elk bull, whose bugle calls had echoed through July, went silent entirely, though he remained in the area. His presence became visible only through the evidence he left: torn bark on trees, his distinctive tracks appearing on the trails at times that made no sense given the ecology. I began sleeping less. The cabin felt smaller as summer progressed, and the nights felt occupied in a way that defied explanation. I would wake to sounds outside, not the normal soundscape of the wilderness, which I had learned to identify and categorize, but something else. Not branches breaking or wind in the trees, but something more like shifting. Movement without obvious cause. The lake became central to my observations. Water is a mirror, and at certain times of day, particularly the hour after sunset when the sky held light but the landscape had surrendered to shadow, the reflection seemed to show movement that the shore didn't contain. A shape in the water, visible in reflection but absent from direct observation. I dismissed this as the corruption of exhaustion affecting my perception, but I recorded it anyway. Objectivity required documentation of everything, including my own potential instability. In the last week of August, Kami did something that broke the pattern entirely. She approached my cabin directly, a violation of the careful distance she had maintained. It was just before dark and I was outside securing the cabin for the night. She emerged from the forest no more than 30 yards away, moving not with the cautious curiosity bears sometimes display near human habitation, but with something that resembled certainty. I had my bear spray holstered, but I didn't reach for it. She wasn't behaving as a threatening animal behaves. She was focused on the cabin itself, specifically on the window facing the lake. She rose on her hind legs, pressed her front paws against the glass, and held that position for what must have been 15 seconds. Then she descended, turned, and walked back into the forest with her cubs trailing behind her. The silence that followed her departure was so complete it seemed to have weight. I locked myself inside. I made coffee on the propane stove, though it was too late in the day for caffeine. My hands were steady. I noticed this with some detachment, but my breathing had become shallow. I opened my logbook and tried to write a factual account of what I'd witnessed. The words wouldn't come in any form that sounded credible. Bear displayed unusual approach behavior, seemed simultaneously too dramatic and too mundane. That night, I heard the animals calling to each other. Not the normal vocalizations of the forest, not bugling or barking or the various cries of distress or territorial claims. This was something else. Rhythmic. Almost like language, though language was a human framework for something that might be operating on entirely different principles. The sounds came from multiple directions simultaneously: the forest edge, the lake shore, somewhere beyond my cabin that I couldn't place. The vocalization continued until dawn, when it stopped with the abruptness of a light being switched off. By morning, I had decided I would not quit. I had come to Glacier because my dying husband loved this place, and because I had believed that wilderness was something clean, something that made sense in ways the world with its hospitals and insurance claims and death certificates did not. But Glacier was revealing something else. Beneath the postcard scenery and the hiking trails, something was moving, something was watching, and I had accepted the responsibility of this station. I would not abandon it because of strangeness. I didn't know yet that the strangeness was only beginning. September brought the first snow to the high peaks, and the valley seemed to contract around this white ceiling. The tourists disappeared entirely by the first week of the month, leaving the park to the rangers and to whatever else moved through the landscape under the cover of thinning daylight. My observations of the animals continued, but the data was becoming increasingly difficult to categorize. Kame and her family hadn't returned to the cabin, but their tracks appeared everywhere, far more frequently than typical dispersal patterns would suggest. I found their paw prints in places bears shouldn't easily reach, the edge of my woodshed, circling the cabin's foundation, even once on the roof, though I couldn't determine how they had accessed it. The deer had multiplied. What had been a small group of 3 had expanded to 7, then a dozen. They appeared each night at the same time, approximately 2 a.m., materializing from the forest in single file. They would stand in the cabin's clearing, their eyes reflecting my flashlight in that unsettling way deer eyes do. And they would wait. For what, I couldn't determine. But the patience in their stillness suggested they knew something I didn't, that they were waiting for a specific event, a moment of significance I hadn't yet recognized. I began implementing more rigorous documentation. I set up a trail camera at the forest edge, angling it toward the clearing. The camera was motion-triggered, so I should have captured images of the nightly visitors. For the first 5 days, the images confirmed my observations. Deer arriving, standing, departing after approximately 30 minutes. But starting on September 10th, the images became corrupted. Not technically corrupted, the camera still functioned, the timestamps were accurate, the batteries held charge. But the images themselves were wrong. The clearing appeared empty in the photos, though I had watched the animals gather through the cabin window. When I adjusted the angle slightly, trying to understand the malfunction, the next batch of images showed something else. The clearing. And in the clearing, a shape that was not quite a deer and not quite anything else. Tall, bipedal, in motion, though I hadn't witnessed any movement that night. I removed the camera. I told myself it was a mechanical failure and that I was projecting meaning onto artifact. I was alone at a remote station, and isolation has well-documented psychological effects. But I didn't retrieve the camera from the cabin's storage. Instead, I left it in my field pack, unopened, unable to look at those images again. The lake itself had become the focus of the animal's apparent attention. Each evening, the elk would appear at the water's edge, his silence more pronounced than any bugling. The deer would stream down from the forest like a migration, but instead of dispersing to forage, they would stand at the shoreline in a line, facing the water. Kami and her cubs would emerge from the deeper forest and join them, the bears showing none of the predatory interest they should have demonstrated toward prey animals so close and so numerous. It was this phenomenon that finally pushed me to contact Kevin directly rather than through routine radio reports. I drove down to the ranger station in West Glacier on a gray day in mid-September, and I requested a meeting. Kevin received me in his office, surrounded by maps and filing cabinets and the mundane bureaucracy of park management. I described the behavioral anomalies in clinical terms. I presented my logbook data. I explained the convergence of multiple species at the lakeshore, the temporal regularity of the gatherings, the apparent coordination between animals that should be competitors or predators and prey. Kevin listened with the careful attention of a man trained to humor problem employees. He offered several hypotheses: a disease outbreak affecting the central nervous system, a change in the water chemistry attracting animals, even a territorial dispute between dominant individuals that was altering normal dispersal patterns. "We'll send someone up to collect water samples," he said, and I knew this was his way of placating me. "Standard procedure, nothing unusual in what you're describing. Animals behave unpredictably, that's why we study them." "It's not unpredictable," I said. "It's the opposite. It's coordinated. It's purposeful." Kevin's expression shifted into something that approximated sympathy. "Meredith, you've been at the station for 3 months. You're living alone, isolated, in an environment that can be psychologically challenging. It's not uncommon for rangers in remote stations to begin interpreting normal patterns as significant. It's a documented phenomenon." "I'm documenting phenomena," I said. "That's literally my job." "Yes. And you're doing it well. The reports are thorough and professional. I'm simply suggesting that you might benefit from some time in town. Take a few days. We can get someone to cover your station." I refused. I drove back to the cabin that afternoon, angry in a way that was clarifying. Kevin had dismissed me, not because my observations were wrong, but because I was a woman alone in the wilderness, and the narrative of female psychological fragmentation was so much easier to accept than data that suggested something genuinely unusual was occurring. That night, for the first time, I saw the animals gather not at dusk but in full darkness. I was awake at 3 a.m., sleep had become sporadic and unreliable. when I heard movement outside. The moon was nearly full, and the snow that had begun accumulating on the higher elevations gave the landscape an inverse quality, as if the darkness itself had become luminous. The elk came first, his massive frame moving with an uncanny silence. Then the bears, Kame leading her cubs in a procession that was almost ceremonial in its precision. And behind them, the deer, dozens of them, more than I had catalogued in my observations, emerging from the forest like they were being extruded from within the trees themselves. They formed a perimeter around the lake, each animal positioned with apparent intentionality. The elk faced the water at the northern point. The bears arranged themselves in a line at the eastern shore. The deer distributed themselves along the southern edge, their bodies creating a curved wall of expectation. And then they waited. I watched from my cabin, every light extinguished to eliminate reflection and distortion, and I waited too. The moon slipped westward. The night deepened. The animals remained motionless, an impossible gathering of predator and prey unified in some purpose I couldn't articulate. At 4:47 a.m., the water began to move. This is not a metaphor. I have spent most of my life around water. I grew up in Colorado, worked in Denver, and had learned the 100 ways water moves under wind, current, gravity, and temperature differentials. I knew how water behaved. This was not that. The surface of the lake rose, not in waves but uniformly, as if the entire body of water was developing sentience and breath. It rose a foot, 2 feet, with the smoothness of something practicing the mechanics of motion. The animals didn't flee. They remained in position, their eyes reflecting the moonlight and something else, something that came from beneath the water. And then it fell, not collapsed or crashed. Fell with deliberate descent, like a door closing. The water settled, and for a moment the lake's surface was perfectly, impossibly calm. Then, exactly as they had arrived, the animals departed. The elk turned and walked into the forest. The bears followed, Kay moving with her cubs in perfect file. The deer, in a process that took nearly an hour, gradually dispersed in groups of 3 and 4. By 6 a.m., the clearing and lakeshore were empty. The water moved normally again, responding to wind and the subtle currents that are always present in deep mountain lakes. I stood at my window, my logbook open, unable to write anything that would capture what I had witnessed. The thing that struck me most, as the sun began to color the sky, was not fear. Fear is a useful emotion in dangerous situations. What I felt was a kind of cold recognition. The animals hadn't been summoned, they had been answering. Something in or beneath the water had called to them with a frequency I couldn't hear, and they had responded. And I, standing in my isolated cabin, had been allowed to observe this only because I happened to be awake. The question that would not leave my mind as September surrendered to October was simple. Had I been awake because I chose to be, or because something wanted me to see? October stripped the trees to their skeletons and the temperatures dropped to a range where nighttime could kill a person who wasn't prepared. The snows came heavier now, covering the high country entirely, creeping down the valley week by week. By mid-October, the station was accessible only by foot or helicopter. Kevin had tried once more to suggest I relocate, to let another ranger cover the position for the winter. I refused again. The animal gatherings had become nightly occurrences now, though the composition shifted. Some nights it was primarily elk and deer. Other nights, bears dominated. Once a mountain lion appeared on the eastern shore, an animal I had seen in the area only once before. The groupings seemed organized by some principle I couldn't identify, but they were definitely organized. I began staying awake through the night watches, documenting everything. The precision of the animals' positioning, the way they never interacted, no hunting, no territorial display, no social behavior of any kind. Just standing, just waiting, just attending to whatever message or call emanated from beneath the lake's surface. Then the hikers appeared. It started with a report from a day hiker who had gotten turned around on the northern trails. I received a radio call around 4 p.m. on October 12th. A woman, she identified herself only as Rebecca, had become disoriented and was asking for guidance back to the main trail. This was not unusual. People underestimate the wilderness constantly. She was well equipped, calm, and I was able to guide her back to the proper path within an hour. But she asked a strange question before signing off. The animals up here, they're not acting normal, are they? Her voice was steady, but underneath was a tremor of something. Concern, perhaps, or the beginning of fear. What animals? I asked, though I knew what she meant. Bears, I think. And deer. Maybe elk. I saw them gathered at a clearing near the lake. They were just standing, watching. like they were waiting for something. Which clearing? I was already thinking about locations, which animals I'd observed where, trying to map her observation onto my data. I'm not sure. I got confused and wandered off the trail. When I realized it, I backtracked. I didn't get a good look at which direction. You're safe now. Head directly south and you'll hit the main trail within half a mile. Thank you, she said. And, Ranger, if you see them like that again, the animals, you might want to leave. There's something wrong with them. The radio went silent. I tried to raise her again, but she didn't respond. I assumed she was too focused on hiking to continue the conversation, but her words remained with me through the evening. She had seen what I had seen. She had recognized the wrongness I couldn't quite articulate. Over the next 2 weeks, there were 3 more reports of unusual animal behavior from day hikers. Each one described a gathering near the water, with animals of different species standing together in apparent coordination. Each report was logged, noted, and filed away as anecdotal evidence that I wasn't losing my grasp on reality. The animal's behavior was being observed by other humans. This was confirmation. But it was also a problem if the animal's activity became more widely known. If hikers began describing coordinated gatherings of predator and prey species, the Park Service would mobilize. Kevin would send people up. There would be scientific teams, researchers, media. The thing that was happening at Lake Kintla would be exposed to scrutiny and intervention. I realized that I didn't want that. This understanding arrived one afternoon in late October as I was gathering wood for the stove. I was stacking branches, and the realization simply manifested, fully formed and undeniable. I didn't want anyone to stop what was happening. I was terrified, genuinely, viscerally afraid of whatever was occurring beneath the water. But I was not afraid of the fear itself. Fear was appropriate. Fear was a correct response to genuine anomaly. What I wanted was to continue observing, to understand, to be present for whatever culmination was approaching, because that it was approaching seemed obvious. The animals had gone from appearing in coordinated groupings to gathering every single night, sometimes multiple times per night. The intensity of whatever was happening was escalating, so when Kevin called on October 28th and asked me to file a summary report for the monthly review, I edited my submissions. I removed references to the nightly gatherings. I explained the larger animal population as natural late-season dispersal. I noted that several hikers had reported sightings of unusual behavior, but attributed this to observer inexperience and distance misinterpretation. Everything seems stable up there? Kevin asked, and I could hear the relief in his voice. He had been concerned about his unstable ranger and the isolated station, and my updated report was his absolution. He wouldn't have to deal with the paperwork of reassignment or replacement. Everything is stable, I confirmed, and it was technically true. The animals were moving in an orderly fashion, operating under rules I didn't understand, but rules nonetheless. Good. Winter's coming in hard. We're closing the northern access road on November 5th. After that, you'll need to helicopter for any emergency evacuation. I'm putting you on a supply drop schedule, November 2nd initially, then depending on conditions, possibly mid-December. Understood. I'm glad you're working out up there, Meredith. Seriously, when you started I wasn't sure, but you've proven yourself. The reports are excellent, even if the behavior is boring now. Thank you, I said, and I wondered what he would think if he knew I was lying. Not maliciously, I wasn't reporting falsehoods, simply omitting relevant data. The distinction seemed important at the time. After we disconnected, I sat in the cabin as the afternoon light failed, and I confronted the fact that I had consciously chosen to conceal information from my supervisor. I had been trained by the Park Service to report all anomalies. I had been hired to maintain the safety and integrity of the protected wilderness, and I was actively working against both those principles. The justification I constructed was simple. Whatever was happening was part of the wildness of Glacier, part of the legitimate functioning of this place. The animals were responding to something that belonged here. The hikers who had observed the gatherings had been temporary visitors, interpreting a phenomenon they couldn't contextualize. The mountain, the lake, the forest, these had their own life, their own processes. I was not meant to interrupt them. I was meant to witness. That night, I watched from the cabin as the animals gathered yet again. Kami emerged first, moving with a directness that suggested she knew exactly where she needed to be. A dozen elk followed, 30, maybe 40 deer funneled down from the forest. Birds that I hadn't known were in the area, ravens perhaps or some other high-elevation species, circled overhead, their silhouettes angular against the last light. And then, for the first time, I saw movement in the water that was visible to me from the shore. It was deep beneath the surface, too deep for me to make out details, But something was moving horizontally, something large and slow. It moved from the northern end of the lake toward the deeper center, and as it moved, the animals' posture shifted, their attention focused. They leaned toward the shore, toward the water, toward whatever had displaced the darkness below. The thing surfaced. It didn't breach or emerge or any of the conventional verbs I might apply. It rose through the surface tension of the water in a manner that suggested the water and air were not meaningful distinctions to it. What I could see was not the whole of it. What I could see was what rose above the moonlit surface, and what rose above the surface was perhaps a fifth of the total mass beneath. It was not a fish. It was not any animal I could categorize. It was dark, textured in a way that suggested movement and malleability, and it bore no features I could identify. No eyes, no mouth, no sense of how it perceived or functioned. It was simply presence, materiality, a thing that existed in Lake Kintla beneath the water and had drawn thousands of pounds of living animals to its shore to witness it. The animals made no sound, neither did I. We simply observed the impossible thing for approximately 5 minutes, and then it sank. It descended with the same smooth deliberation with which it had risen, and the water collapsed behind it as if it had never disturbed the surface at all. The animals waited another hour, then, as they always did, they dispersed. The gathering was complete for another night. I sat on the floor of my cabin for the remainder of the night, and I made a decision. When the helicopter came on November 2nd with my supply shipment, I would tell the pilot that my vehicle had suffered mechanical failure. I would request that my assignment be extended indefinitely. I would prepare for a winter in the cabin, watching, waiting, recording the phenomenon in my logbook with the obsessiveness of a man who understands he is the only observer in the world capable of documenting something genuinely extraordinary. I had come to Glacier to escape grief. What I had found instead was the thing that all real wilderness ultimately offers. The recognition that humans are not the center of the world, that processes vast and incomprehensible move through the landscape regardless of our understanding or approval, that some things are not meant to be known but only seen. And I would see it. Every night I would watch. Every night I would document. Every night the thing in the lake would rise and I would be there, the only conscious human witness to something that the world wasn't ready to know existed. The supply helicopter arrived on schedule, a gray machine that cut through the mountain air with the efficiency of something that didn't respect wilderness so much as tolerate it. The pilot, a taciturn man named Gregory who had made the mountain routes his specialty, helped me offload the new supplies. Propane canisters, food stores, medical supplies, batteries, everything required to survive a winter at 1,400 meters elevation in a remote valley. "You planning to stay through the season?" Gregory asked as he stacked the canisters near the cabin. "Looks that way," I said. "Vehicle troubles. Kevin mentioned something about that. I can take a look if you want. I've rebuilt engines that have seen worse." "I appreciate it, but it's going to take a mechanic down in town. Transmission work." This was a lie, but it was a lie that would satisfy the paperwork. A transmission failure required specific expertise and replacement parts. No one could fault me for not attempting repairs at a remote station without proper equipment. Kevin would note it, authorize the work to be done during the spring season, and adjust the budget. I would remain at the cabin through winter, undisturbed. "Well, it's your choice," Gregory said. "Weather's deteriorating faster than the forecast. You sure you want to be out here?" "I'm sure." He shrugged and finished securing the cargo. "Your call. Next supply run is mid-December unless there's an emergency. You've got the emergency beacon if things get bad." "I'll be fine." He left within 10 minutes, and I watched the helicopter climb above the valley and disappear over the peaks. The sound of it faded gradually, and then I was alone again, but now with the knowledge that no one would be returning until December, and no one from the outside world would think to check on me until then. The isolation felt complete, in a way it hadn't before. Not just geographic isolation, but a deliberate severance from the structures that usually tethered me to human society. I had supplies for 2 months. I had warmth, water, shelter. I had my logbook and my observations and my increasing compulsion to understand what was happening at the lake. November brought the snow in earnest. The temperatures dropped into the negative range, and the landscape transformed into something that was barely recognizable from the autumnal wilderness I had arrived in. The trees became sculptures of white. The lake developed a skin of ice that thickened daily. The animals continued to gather, now moving through heavy snow, their behavior unchanged by the environmental hostility. My own behavior, however, was changing in ways I could observe but not fully control. I began spending more time outside, not productive time. I wasn't maintaining trails or conducting ecological surveys. I was simply standing in the cold, watching, waiting, sometimes for hours, until my fingers and toes went numb and I had to retreat to the cabin to avoid hypothermia. This was not rational behavior, this was obsession, and I recognized it as such while being unable to alter its trajectory. I also began to experience sleep disturbances of a different character than before. I would wake convinced that something had knocked on the cabin door but finding nothing. I would hear vocalizations that sounded almost like language, coming from multiple directions simultaneously, and I would turn circles in my cabin trying to identify the source. Once I found muddy paw prints on my front steps leading from the forest toward the door, stopping exactly at the threshold. The thing in the lake continued its nightly ascent. As November progressed into December, I began to notice that it was rising higher, its bulk becoming increasingly visible. What had been an indistinct mass beneath the surface was now clearly a shape. It had a form, though the form was not consistent. It seemed to shift, to reorganize itself, as if it were composed of component parts that could reconfigure according to some principle I didn't understand. On November 27th, I made contact with it. This was not planned. I was standing at the water's edge during one of the evening gatherings, positioned further from the cabin than I usually ventured, trying to get a clearer view of what rose from the depths. The animals paid me no attention. I had become part of the gathering, just another witness, another consciousness called to the shore by forces I couldn't articulate. The thing rose, and I was closer this time, close enough to see that what I had taken for texture was actually movement. The surface of it was in constant flux, cells or structures or something at that scale rotating and replacing each other continuously. It was not a solid thing. It was a process made manifest, and then it reached toward me. I did not panic. This was the first notable shock to my self-perception, that I could watch what I understood to be an appendage of some kind extend from the water, move through the air, approach my position with what seemed like curiosity, and remain functional rather than flee. The appendage did not touch me. It stopped a few feet away, and I could see it more clearly now. It was made of the same shifting material as the main body, a composition of layers rotating past each other, opening and closing like an eye that was trying to perceive something. It rotated in my direction, and I had the unmistakable sense of being studied, of being observed the way I had been observing the animals, with the dispassionate attention of something trying to understand something fundamentally alien to its experience. Then it withdrew. The appendage retracted into the water. The bulk descended. The lake settled. The animals dispersed as they always did. But I was changed. In that moment of mutual observation, something had shifted in my understanding. The thing in the lake was not malevolent or predatory in any conventional sense. It was aware. It was curious. It was exploring the world and the creatures in it with the kind of patience that comes from having infinite time, and it had noticed me. The next morning I found a message on my logbook. This is perhaps the most difficult thing for me to describe accurately. I had left the logbook on my cabin table when I went to bed. My doors and windows were locked. I had developed this habit out of a caution that I now recognized as partly irrational. When I woke and retrieved the book, the last page contained marks that had not been there when I fell asleep. They were not words in any language I recognized. They were not random marks either. They were symbols, or perhaps mathematical notation, or perhaps some representation of something that human languages have no category for. What I recognized with absolute certainty was that they were intentional. Someone or something had written them. The pen I used had been on my table and its ink was slightly smudged where the marks had been made. The thing in the lake had learned to write. I spent 3 days analyzing those symbols, comparing them to mathematical notation, linguistic systems, ancient script, anything that might provide a key to their meaning. I found nothing, but I kept them. I wouldn't erase them. They were evidence of something that my rational mind was struggling to accommodate. That the thing in the water had communicated with me directly. The gatherings intensified through December. Every night now, hundreds of animals, perhaps thousands, converging on the lake. Bears that couldn't possibly all be in the local population. Elk, bulls, and cows together, ignoring seasonal aggression dynamics. Wolves that should not exist this far south, standing alongside deer that should flee them. Everything the wilderness considered separate was unified in a single purpose, and each night the thing rose higher. By December 10th, I could see more of it. The appendages had multiplied. I could count at least 8 distinct extensions, each composed of that mutable material, each occasionally reaching toward the shore, exploring. The animals remained patient. They didn't flee or fight. They simply attended to its presence. On December 12th, the weather turned catastrophic. A storm came through that was genuinely dangerous, winds of 60 miles per hour or more. snow accumulating at a rate I'd never experienced. The visibility dropped to near zero. I remained inside the cabin, maintaining the fire, listening to the wind try to find its way inside. But the animals didn't leave. I could see them through the windows, blurred by snow and wind, still maintaining their positions around the lake. The commitment to whatever this gathering represented was absolute. They would stand in this killing cold, in these blinding conditions, and maintain formation. For what? What was the purpose? On the third night of the storm, I received an answer. The radio crackled with a voice I did not recognize. It was not human, though it used the modulation of human speech. It came through in fragments, as if struggling with the mechanics of verbal communication. This is transmission, understanding, your species. You stand, you observe, you record. Similar, pattern, similar, purpose. What are you? I asked, my voice steady despite the way my hands shook. Designation, unclear. Your language, insufficient. Movement, change, hunger and exploration. I have been beneath, long beneath, the lake, safe, the creatures, they teach, you understand, the teaching. What do you want? This seemed like the only question that mattered. To surface, to walk, to understand the above. The creatures prepare me. Each night they give me memory, experience, how to be, how to move, how to exist in air and light. You are different. You do not give, you take, you record. You want to hold what you see without releasing. I can taste it. Your observation. It is delicious. The transmission degraded. I waited for it to resume, but it didn't. I spent the remainder of the night trying to re-establish contact, but the radio remained silent except for wind noise and static. By morning, the storm had passed. The sky cleared to a crystalline blue. The snow lay in perfect white on everything. And the animals were gone. They had dispersed during the night, leaving behind only tracks. But I could follow those tracks, and what I found at the lake's shore would change everything. The ice at the water's edge had been broken from beneath. Large sections were missing. And extending from the largest break was a path. Something had emerged from the water and moved toward the forest. The trail was unclear, partially obscured by wind-blown snow, but it was definitely there. Something had left the lake. The search took me 3 days. The trail was difficult to follow. The wind had obscured it in places, and the thing leaving it was evidently still learning to move in a controlled fashion, its path erratic and doubling back on itself frequently. But it went northeast, away from my cabin, away from the main valleys, toward the highest reaches of the park where few humans ever ventured. I followed it without adequate equipment, without notifying anyone of my absence, driven by a compulsion I didn't question. Part of me understood that I was abandoning my responsibilities, that I was potentially putting myself in genuine danger. But another part of me recognized that what was happening was beyond the scope of my job, beyond the authority of the Park Service, beyond human categories entirely. The trail led to a cave system in the high country, marked on park maps as stable and largely unexplored. The opening was narrow, requiring me to crawl for the first 50 feet. My flashlight illuminated stone, ice, minerals glinting, and then the cave opened into a vast space. It was there. The thing from the lake had found refuge in this chamber. The cave floor was wet, fed by groundwater, and the creature was moving through it, filling the space with itself, learning the dimensions of the environment. In the dim beam of my flashlight, I could see it more clearly than I ever had in the water. It was, I realized, still mostly liquid. Water was part of its composition, essential to its existence. The portions that had extended toward me, the appendages and the surfaces, those were solidified matter that the creature could shape and reshape. It sensed my arrival. The entire mass oriented toward me, and what I perceived as an eye. Perhaps I was projecting humanity onto something that had no eyes, focused in my direction. "You have come," it said. The words emerged not from my radio but directly into my mind, or perhaps into my ears. The mechanism was unclear. The water carries you. Your blood carries salt, like the lake. You are not wholly separate. "What are you?" I asked again, becoming. I was the deep thing, the waiting thing. I came here in a manner your language has no category for. I was drawn to the particular vibration of this lake, the minerals, the temperature, the pressure. I grew here, slowly at first, across years that matched the age of mountains, then faster. The animals taught me. They came when I called, and I learned from them. Movement and aggression and hunger and care. All the patterns that life above embodies. Now I am becoming something that can walk. Why? What's your purpose? The creature extended what I can only describe as a tendril of semi-solid material, and it touched my shoulder. It was cold but not freezing. It was wet but not uncomfortable. It was the most violated I had felt by any physical contact in years, because it was so thoroughly alien. Everything that has ever emerged from the depths has sought to explore the above. Everything that has ever lived in darkness has dreamed of light. I am no different. I simply needed teachers, and your animals were patient. They are still teaching. Every night more of them come. Soon I will be able to walk to the nearest town. I will see what you have built. I will understand how you organize. Then I will decide if I remain hidden or if I announce myself. People will kill you, I said. When they discover what you are, they'll send hunters, scientists, military. You'll be captured or destroyed. Perhaps. Or perhaps. And the creature paused, and I swear I could feel something like amusement in its silence. Perhaps they will recognize what I am, and they will be honest. Perhaps some of your kind will want to understand instead of destroy. I have learned from my observation of your species through the animal's memories that you contain multitudes. You are not singular. Some of you value the new, some of you value the unusual, some of you are not afraid to change what you understand about the world. You're gambling with your existence, I said. All existence is a gamble, the creature replied. The animals taught me that. Every birth is a gamble. Every moment is a gamble. I will simply gamble openly. I don't remember the exact moment I decided to return to my cabin. The conversation in the cave continued for hours, a profound exchange of perspectives between entities that had little in common except the shared understanding that consciousness and awareness were strange and miraculous things. The creature told me about the sensation of being beneath water, of existing in darkness, of the particular quality of knowledge that comes from perceiving through pressure and temperature and chemical composition rather than light. I told it about human grief, about why I had come to the mountains, about the particular pain of losing someone and the way wilderness offers compensation not through healing but through perspective. When I finally emerged from the cave, the sun was setting, painting the peaks in shades of rust and gold. I walked back down the trail I had followed up, and I didn't encounter the creature again. It had what it needed now. It had made contact. The transaction between us was complete. My cabin was exactly as I had left it. The fire had burned down, the temperature inside having dropped to something uncomfortable but survivable. I rebuilt the fire and sat waiting for dawn, knowing with absolute certainty what I had to do. I called Kevin on the radio at 6 a.m. Meredith, where have you been? You missed the emergency check-in yesterday. I'm fine, I said. I need to report something. I've discovered evidence of geological instability near the cave systems in the northern high country. Possible subsidence, new water channels. I think the Park Service should send a team to evaluate the stability. Are you in danger? He asked, and I appreciated the concern in his voice. No. I'm well away from the affected area, but I wanted to flag it before winter makes access more difficult. I'll make a note of it. We can send someone up in the spring for a survey. For now, just stay safe. I will, I said, and I meant it. I didn't expect Kevin to send anyone. The Park Service moved slowly. The geological survey would be delayed by budget concerns and administrative timelines. By the time anyone arrived to investigate, the creature would be gone. It would have surfaced in some river or waterway and made its way toward civilization through the network of flowing water that connects Glacier to the rest of the North American continent. The question of what would happen then was not something I could contemplate without vertigo. Governments would mobilize. Scientists would debate its nature. It would become a phenomenon, an event, a thing for human consciousness to absorb and integrate into its understanding of reality. But that was not my responsibility anymore. I spent the remainder of December at my cabin, and I made no further observations. I didn't return to the lake. I didn't file detailed reports. When Gregory arrived for the final supply drop on December 20th, I told him the cabin's heater had malfunctioned slightly but was now repaired, and everything was stable. He didn't stay long. The weather was deteriorating again, and he wanted to complete the drop before conditions made flight unsafe. You're a strange one, Meredith, he said as he finished unloading supplies. Most people, they'd be counting the days until they could leave a place like this. You seem like you're settling in for the duration. I like the quiet, I said. Quiet is one thing. Being completely alone in the mountains in winter is another. Most people, that breaks them. Maybe I was already broken, I suggested. He regarded me carefully, then nodded as if this made a kind of sense. Well, if you need anything, you call. There's no shame in requesting evacuation if it becomes too much. I'll call if I need it, I promised. But I knew I wouldn't call. I would stay through the winter. I would maintain the cabin and the log entries and the fiction that a Park Service ranger was diligently monitoring a remote station. I would wait for spring, when the roads reopened and the helicopters stopped coming, and I would walk away. There was another world beyond Glacier, a world of ordinary human concerns and predictable landscapes. I had left that world to grieve in a place where grief seemed somehow more honest. I had found instead something far stranger, a glimpse of the impossible, a moment of contact with something that had no category in human experience. I had been allowed to observe, and in observing I had changed. The thing in the lake had taught me something too, not through any explicit communication but through its simple existence, that the world was far stranger than any framework I had been given to understand it. That consciousness wore many forms, that the wilderness was not a place of peace but a place of radical transformation. My name is Meredith Crow, and I am no longer entirely sure who that person is anymore. But I remain in the cabin, watching the mountains, listening to the wind in the trees, and waiting for the day when what I have witnessed becomes, for the world, something between myth and memory. The lake is silent now. The animals have returned to their normal patterns. Life has reasserted its familiar hierarchies and pursuits, but sometimes, in the very deepest part of the night, I hear something like language moving through the darkness. And I know I am not alone in this observation. The witness has a witness. And somewhere in the flowing water that connects all things, something vast is learning still. My name is Dakota Walsh and I work as a backcountry ranger for Glacier National Park. 3 years ago, I left a comfortable life in Missoula to take this position, and people still ask me why. The answer is complicated, and it's not the one they want to hear. I accepted the job because I was disappearing, not physically. I was there, attending meetings, responding to emails, showing up at my apartment every evening, but something essential was being consumed from the inside out. In the city, surrounded by people and noise and the constant hum of connectivity, I felt like I was being hollowed. My therapist called it burnout. My mother called it depression. I called it suffocation. The Park Service needed someone willing to spend 8 months a year alone in the wilderness, managing trails, maintaining the cabin at Many Glacier Lake, and responding to emergencies across 30,000 acres. When I read the job posting, it felt like someone had finally understood what I needed: solitude that was purposeful, not pathological. Isolation with a mission. The cabin sits on the eastern shore of Many Glacier Lake, built in 1974 from logs and stone. It's a 15-mile hike from the nearest trailhead, accessible only during the brief window of July through September when the snow melts enough to make the route passable. I do this hike 4 times a year, once at the start of season to open the cabin, once in the middle to resupply, once in late August for maintenance, and once at the end to secure everything before the snow returns. The rest of the time, I'm alone. The cabin itself is small. 2 rooms, the main space with a wood stove and sleeping area, and a storage room where I keep tools, emergency supplies, and the water filtration system. The outhouse sits 50 yards behind, built to code and maintained meticulously. Solar panels provide power for my radio, the only reliable communication with the outside world. There's a landline that works maybe 60% of the time, attached to a satellite uplink that costs the park $300 a month. I have a satellite phone for genuine emergencies, but cell service is non-existent. The lake itself is beautiful in a way that photographs fail to capture. The water is so clear that you can see 30 feet down on calm days, the bottom composed of smooth stones arranged by glaciers that retreated 10,000 years ago. 3 peaks surround it: Mount Jackson to the north, Mount Cleveland to the west, and Mount Stimson rising like a sentinel to the south. In July, the slopes are bright with wildflowers. In August, the mornings frost over and I watch my breath create shapes in the thin air. By September, the aspens turn gold and the temperature drops below freezing most nights. This was my 7th season at the cabin. I arrived in early July as I always do, hiking in with a full pack, supplies for 3 weeks, reports to file, and the energy that comes from leaving civilization behind. The trail in was clear, no downed trees, no washouts, which surprised me slightly. Usually there's at least one section that needs work. I made a note to investigate, though I figured it was probably just maintenance that the other rangers had handled before their transfers. The cabin was exactly as I'd left it. The deadbolt was secure, windows intact. The interior smelled of old wood and the particular mustiness that accumulates even with the windows cracked during the off-season. I propped the door open, let the air move through, and began the familiar ritual of opening the place up. Testing the stove, checking for mouse droppings. There were a few in the storage room, minor. filling the water tanks from the lake, firing up the solar panels. By evening, everything was operational. I built a fire and sat outside on the bench I've maintained for 3 years, watching the light die across the water. This is the moment I live for, that first night back, when the weight of the park settles into my shoulders like a familiar coat. I'm responsible for everything here. Every trail marker, every ranger station, every person who enters this territory. It's the closest I've come to feeling necessary since I left my old life. The next morning, I noticed the elk. She was standing in the shallow water on the northern shore, about half a mile away. Even at that distance, I could see something was wrong. Her posture was rigid, her head tilted at an angle that seemed uncomfortable. She wasn't drinking or grazing. She was simply standing there, utterly still, with the water reaching to her chest. I watched her for 20 minutes through my binoculars. She never moved, never blinked that I could see. When I finally looked away to make breakfast, I felt an inexplicable relief, as if her stillness had been contagious. By afternoon, she was gone. I told myself it was nothing. Elk behave strangely sometimes. Maybe she was injured or ill. Maybe she'd simply moved on to a different water source. I was a ranger. I understood that not everything required investigation or explanation. The wilderness is full of small mysteries that resolve themselves without intervention, but the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong refused to leave. Over the next 3 days, I hiked the perimeter trails, checking on the marked routes and noting any damage. The ecosystem seemed normal. Marmots whistled, pikas scattered across the rock fields. A black bear fished near the outlet stream. But there was a quietness to the animal activity that I couldn't quite name. The birds seemed to spend more time in the high branches, and I heard significantly fewer ground birds than in previous seasons. On the 4th morning, I found the first set of tracks. They were on the trail leading up toward Gunsight Lake, about 2 miles from the cabin. Larger than any bear track I'd seen, though they had a strange quality, almost like they'd been made by something trying to walk upright on an animal's feet. The toe marks were deep and desperate looking, as if whoever made them had been pressing hard into the soil. They ran north for several hundred yards before disappearing. I radioed down to the ranger station at Lake McDonald, 4,000 feet below and 12 miles south. Control, this is Many Glacier Station. Possible large animal activity on the north perimeter trails. Request identification assistance. Static. Control. Come in. More static. Then, Many Glacier. Copy. What's the nature of the sighting? Negative sighting. Tracks only. Heavy predation signs potential. Unknown classification. A pause longer than radio static could account for. Many Glacier, we copy. Document and monitor. Weather coming in tonight. Frontal system. Possible precipitation. Will attempt contact tomorrow morning. I confirmed and shut down the radio. That night the temperature dropped to 38 degrees. I kept the wood stove going, stoked it before bed the way I always do. The cabin ticked and settled around me. At 3 in the morning, I woke to a sound I couldn't identify. Not wind, not animal, something in between. A low sound that seemed to come from the lake itself, almost like the water had learned to vocalize. I lay in my sleeping bag and waited for it to repeat. It didn't. By morning, I was certain I'd dreamed it. The second lost hiker came in on a Tuesday mid-morning, radioed down from Gunsight Pass by a group of 3 backpackers who'd found him wandering the alpine meadow without a pack, no water bottle, no jacket despite the weather turning. His name was Marcus. He was from California. He'd been missing for 6 days. The group brought him down to my cabin. It was the closest shelter, and the rangers at Lake McDonald were still 4 hours away. I could hear him before I saw him. A sound like continuous whimpering, high-pitched and animal in its desperation. He was thin, not trail thin, not the kind of lean you get from backpacking for 2 weeks. He was hollow. His skin had a grayish quality, like it was being viewed through smoke. His eyes were the worst part. They were moving, but not seeing, tracking things that weren't there. When I tried to speak to him, he flinched. "It's okay," I said. "You're safe. You're in the ranger station at Many Glacier." He grabbed my wrist with a grip that felt like iron. "They won't stop," he said. "They keep coming closer." Who? What keeps coming closer? The ones that follow the sound. The ones that heard me screaming. I got him water and a blanket. One of the backpackers, a woman named Jessica, helped me get him sitting down. He was shaking so badly that water spilled from the cup. "Has he said anything else?" I asked. "Not really. We found him saying the same thing over and over. They're still there, they're still there, they're still there." When we touched him, he screamed. I called down to Lake McDonald with the situation. They said a helicopter would come in as soon as the weather cleared. Until then, Marcus would stay with me. I set him up in the storage room, where there was more space, and gave him food. He wouldn't eat. He would drink water, great gasping gulps of it, but he wouldn't touch the food. He also wouldn't speak about what had happened, though he continued to mutter fragments. 7 miles from camp. Heard it before I saw it. Went down toward the lake when it got dark. Should have run higher. That night he screamed, not once. Over and over, every few hours he would suddenly cry out as if something had stabbed him. Each time I'd rush in to find him awake, drenched in sweat, staring at something on the wall that I couldn't see. By the third scream, around midnight, I gave him a mild sedative from the emergency medical supplies. It was against protocol, but the alternative was listening to a man splinter into pieces while I sat in the next room. When he finally slept, I went outside. The night was clear. Stars thick enough to see the dust clouds of the Milky Way. The temperature was dropping. I could feel autumn's edge in the air. I stood at the shore and looked out at the water, which reflected the starlight in fragments. The elk was back, standing in the shallows on the far side, silhouetted against the luminous water. She was in the exact same position as before. I pulled out the radio and called down to Lake McDonald. Control, we have a secondary issue. Possible wildlife anomaly. Same location as previous report. I need wildlife services assessment. What's the animal? Came the response. Elk, cow. Appears to be maintaining position in shallow water for extended periods. Possible illness or injury. Recommend assessment before helicopter evacuation of injured hiker. Copy, Many Glacier. Wildlife will coordinate with your location on helicopter arrival, ETA 800 hours tomorrow if weather permits. I watched the elk until my legs ached from standing, then went back inside to listen to Marcus breathe through the sedative and wonder what he'd actually seen. In the morning, the helicopter came and went. Marcus was lifted out on a gurney, still half sedated, whispered something to the pilot that I couldn't hear. The wildlife officer, a woman named Dr. Reeves, stayed behind. She was in her 50s, weathered in the way of people who spend their whole lives outdoors, with hands that looked like they could do anything. Show me, she said. We hiked to where I'd found the tracks, then to Gunsight Pass where the backpackers had discovered Marcus. The tracks were still there, but they'd been overwritten by boot prints and wind. Dr. Reeves examined the available impressions, photographed them, and said very little. Definitely not a bear, she finally offered. The gait is wrong, it's almost simian, but the foot structure is bizarre, too long, like someone took a human foot and stretched it. What about the location the hiker mentioned? 7 miles from camp, let's walk it. It took us 3 hours to backtrack what we thought was Marcus's path. We found his campsite around noon, a disturbed area where his tent had been, sleeping bag torn open, supplies scattered. But what caught my attention was what Dr. Reeves found next to the sleeping bag. Drag marks, deep gouges in the soil, leading away from the camp in a straight line toward a massive old pine that stood dead and bleached gray. Something came into his camp, Dr. Reeves said, her voice very quiet. And something was dragged out. Dragged where? She looked at me and I saw something in her expression that I'd been trying not to acknowledge for days. Fear, genuine animal fear. Nowhere good. We followed the drag marks. They went for about 40 yards before ending abruptly in a small clearing surrounded by dense understory. The soil was disturbed, dark, not with blood exactly, but something else. Dr. Reeves knelt and examined it, then stood up quickly. This is old scavenging behavior, she said. Something fed here, multiple times. Multiple? Look at the dispersal pattern of the remains. There are fragments going back weeks, maybe months. Whatever's doing this has been using this location as a feeding ground. The word remains hung in the air between us. What kind of animal makes a feeding ground here? I asked. One that's not in our database. We returned to the cabin as the light was dying. Dr. Reeves spent another hour on her phone and laptop, making calls to the State Wildlife Office, the university, the National Park Service. The conversations were clipped and technical. Nobody had answers. The tracks didn't match anything in the behavioral database. The feeding pattern didn't match any known large predator in the region. The gait analysis was consistent with anomalous skeletal morphology. That word anomalous kept coming back. Before the helicopter returned to pick her up the next morning, Dr. Reeves told me something that she said I shouldn't repeat in my official report. In 1987, we had a ranger up here who called in similar tracks, different location but same basic description. Long-toed, bipedalish gait, feeding patterns that didn't match known behavior. He requested transfer before the season ended. Never worked wilderness again. But before he left, he told another ranger something. He said the tracks got closer every day. Not to him, he was in a cabin, well supplied, able to defend himself, but they got closer to something. He said he watched animals disappearing from the area in a spiral, working inward towards something at the center. He said whatever was leaving the tracks, it was calling something, and something was answering. Calling what? I asked. He didn't say, or didn't know. She left in the helicopter at dawn, and I was alone again. But now I was alone with the knowledge that something was happening at Many Glacier Lake, something that predated my arrival, something that nobody in the park's service fully understood. I kept the fire high that night. I also loaded the shotgun, a 12-gauge that sits in the cabin for bare emergencies, and placed it against the wall beside my sleeping bag. I had no ammunition for anything larger, no weapons that would be effective against something that could live in this wilderness, something that had survived here long enough to develop feeding patterns, territories, calling behaviors. 2 days later, the elk disappeared, not just from the lake shore, though she was gone from there. I found her 3 miles downstream, dead in the shallows of the creek that fed Many Glacier. Her body was in an advanced state of decomposition despite having likely died only the day before. The smell was overwhelming, sweet and rotten in a way that didn't match any normal mortality, and there were marks on her legs, deep punctures that had been made with force, as if something had been trying to get inside her. I documented it, took photographs, and called Dr. Reeves. The carcass shows signs of scavenging, but also signs of predation that occurred post-mortem, she said after I described it. The puncture marks are consistent with something that was attempting to extract material from the bone. Extract what? Marrow. Maybe nutrient-rich organs. It suggests nutritional desperation. Dakota, I'm going to send up another officer. I want samples. This is beyond my jurisdiction now. The second officer, a man named Detective Morrison from the State Wildlife Bureau, arrived the next morning. He was younger than I expected, maybe 35, with the efficient manner of someone used to processing crime scenes. He spent hours examining the elk, collecting swabs, taking measurements, and making notes that he wouldn't share with me. Before he left, he asked me directly, "Have you seen anything? Anything at all? A large animal? Tracks? Sounds?" "Sounds," I said. "The first night I came back, I heard something from the lake. Like vocalization." He didn't write that down. "What kind of vocalization?" I couldn't identify it. "Low frequency. Not like any animal I've heard." "Did it sound distressed?" I thought about the question. No. It sounded like communication, like it was calling out to something. He looked out at the water, his jaw tightening. "Okay, look, I'm going to recommend that the Park Service increase your supply dropouts and improve your communication protocols. I don't know what we're dealing with here, but I don't like the pattern. 2 lost people in as many weeks, one of them severely traumatized, and wildlife behavior that's outside parameters. I'm going to push for additional ranger presence, but budget." He trailed off and shrugged. "When?" I asked. "I don't know. Could be 2 weeks. Could be longer." After he left, I was alone again, and the season was turning. August was shifting towards September. The light was changing, becoming more golden and urgent, the quality of sunlight in the afternoon taking on the particular quality of expiration. I had maybe 4 weeks left before I needed to hike out, secure the cabin, and leave the park to winter. That night, the vocalization came again, but this time it was different. This time there were multiple sounds, overlapping, and they came not just from the lake but from the surrounding wilderness. They came from the direction of Gunsight Pass, from the north toward Mount Jackson, from somewhere deep in the valley to the east. They were calling to each other, these sounds, having a conversation in a language that predated speech, predated human understanding. I realized then that Marcus had been trying to tell me something important. They kept coming closer because he had called to them first. When he screamed, when he was desperate and afraid, when his voice was breaking and fractured, he had made a sound that meant something to them. He had, through his terror, invited them to listen, and they had come. I made the decision on September 3rd. The weather was turning, the season was collapsing like a lung, and I had 12 days of supplies left. I could stretch it to 17 if I was careful, but that assumed nothing else happened. It assumed that the sounds would stop, that the feeling of presence that had grown stronger each night would dissipate, that the mountain would return to its previous state of solitude. I didn't believe any of that. I packed carefully, everything essential, nothing extra. My reports, my maps, my documentation of the season. I left the supply cache full and sealed, a message on the radio for the next ranger that the cabin might need inspection and that wildlife assessment should be priority protocol. I was 3 hours from the cabin, on the trail down toward the first trailhead, when I heard the scream. It wasn't human, Or rather, it was something trying to be human, approximating human, using human vocalization as a template but failing at the basic mechanics. It came from behind me, from the direction of the cabin, a sound of rage and hunger so profound that I felt something in my chest attempt to flee my body. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I ran. The trail down from Many Glacier is a 15-mile descent through subalpine forest and into the valley proper. I'd hiked it dozens of times, but I'd never run it, and I've never run it in fear. The trees became a blur, my lungs burned. My legs screamed for me to stop, to rest, to sit down and wait for whatever was moving through the wilderness to catch up or lose interest. I didn't stop. I reached the first ranger station at dusk, a small structure maintained for day hikers to escape bad weather. I locked myself inside and kept the light off. I sat in the darkness with the shotgun across my lap and waited for sounds that never came. In the morning, I called down to Lake McDonald on the radio. "Control, this is Many Glacier Station. I'm requesting emergency relief. I'm at Gunsight Pass Ranger Shelter. Environmental contamination. Possible infectious agent in the Many Glacier area. Requesting extraction and quarantine protocol." The response came faster than I expected. Many Glacier, copy. Explain contamination. Unknown wildlife vectors. Behavioral anomalies exceeding safe parameters. Recommend immediate closure of Many Glacier drainage and restricted access protocol pending investigation. Copy, Many Glacier. Extraction is en route. ETA 2 hours. The helicopter came and took me out. I never looked back at the peaks surrounding Many Glacier, never watched the cabin disappear below, never confirmed whether something emerged on the shore as the blades began to turn. In my official report, I documented the tracks, the lost hiker, the wildlife incidents, and the pattern of behavioral anomalies. I recommended the Many Glacier drainage be closed to public access and that a full ecological survey be conducted. What I didn't report was the sound. What I didn't report was the way that last scream had contained something that might have been words, a human mouth shaped into a human language but used by something that had never been human and would never be. What I didn't report was the understanding I'd come to in the darkness of that ranger station. The wilderness had never belonged to us. We were the intruders there, moving through someone else's territory, speaking in voices that meant nothing, making sounds that were recognized as either prey or threat or, in Marcus's case, as an invitation. I didn't go back to the cabin. The Park Service reassigned me to the front desk at park headquarters, and I spent the winter processing paperwork and watching through office windows as the mountains turned white. In April, when the higher elevations were still impassable, they brought in a full survey team. The official report stated that the tracks couldn't be identified, the feeding sites suggested normal predation patterns, and there was no evidence of threat to public safety. The Many Glacier drainage was closed for the entire following season for routine maintenance. In September of the following year, when they opened it back up, they staffed the cabin with 2 rangers instead of 1. That lasted for 3 seasons. Now there's a ranger there for only 6 weeks during peak season, and the position is one of the hardest to fill in the Park Service. People don't stay. Rangers request transfer. Some disappear for a week and then apply to work in the cities, taking desk jobs, taking anything that puts them in civilization. I understood why, finally. The wilderness had something it wanted to protect, something it was preserving in those high meadows and deep valleys. And occasionally, people got too close. Occasionally, they heard the sounds. Occasionally, they screamed. And sometimes, the wilderness answered. I still think about Many Glacier. I drive up toward the park sometimes, park at one of the overlooks, and look up at the peaks surrounding that remote valley. I wonder if the cabin is still there, if something is still maintaining itself in that territory, if the vocalizations still happen on the nights when the weather turns and the season begins to die. I know what I heard. I know what I saw, and I know that I was right to leave.